All right, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at our Alternative COP launch of CJCM Strategic Perspective Documents. Today we are having a People's and Workers' Assembly to accelerate and deepen the just transition now. Together we can secure a democratic and climate justice future. We have an exciting and packed program today, and I'm just going to run us all through it, and then Awande Buthelezi from COPAC will run us through the objectives. So I am Jane Cherry, sitting in a very wet and rainy Johannesburg, and we've got some participants from all over the world and respondents. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. We are going to start after our opening and objectives with our first panel on Strategic Perspective Document 1, which will be presented by the COPAC team, Charles Simane, Awande Buthelezi, myself, and Ferial Adam. And this document looks at resisting climate apartheid and ecocidal capitalism towards a global climate justice bloc for a just world peace, earth democracy, and climate justice deal for Africa. And then we have a number of respondents, and they're all listed there on the program. And Vish will be chairing this session, so he will introduce all of the respondents. They will all be responding to the document, which we have sent in previously. Our next panel, panel 2, looks at the 3 remaining strategic perspective documents. So these will be shared by Awande, myself, and Vish. And then after that, we will have some time for discussion, about 20 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And then we're going to launch 2 exciting resources. The first is an activist guide, People's Planning for a Deep Just Transition, which we put together with a lot of your input, and then we finalized it recently, and that will be launched by Ferial Adam. And after that, one of our partner organizations, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, will be sharing their recent video, Harvest of Neglect, and we will end with a way forward and closing by Vishwas. All right, I'm going to hand over to Awande to take us through the objectives.
Thank you everyone for joining us here today. We appreciate the time that you've taken out, and also we don't underestimate the importance of this gathering. During this week of COP, the international aspects of the climate crisis and the climate struggle are highlighted and are probably at the forefront of people's minds. But it's in a space like this where we heighten those international solidarities, but also local and regional climate justice struggles. So we're hoping today, through the introduction of these strategic documents, these strategic perspectives, to bring them to the fore, to have a good discussion with regards to the importance of these strategic perspectives, the contribution that they make in heightening the climate justice struggle, both locally and internationally, and also making sure that these strategic perspectives are also able to introduce, for all of us here, some new concrete ways in which we can strengthen those linkages, but also ways in which for us to take this struggle to the next level. I'd also like to remind everyone that we also have our petition still running on halting external funding for the South African government's just transition until they stop all new investments in oil and gas. And that petition, if you would be so kind as to share it, will be shared in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Prof. Vishwas Satka, who will be chairing the first session.
Thank you, Awande and Jane, and welcome to everybody who's joined us as participants, and particularly our guests who are here today to engage with us. The first panel, comrades, is launching a perspective titled Resisting Climate Apartheid and Ecocide Towards a Global Climate Justice Bloc for a Just World Peace, Earth Democracy, and a Climate Justice Deal for Africa. We've invited some of the leading climate justice activists, movements on our planet, on our continent, to engage with this document. And today we're just initiating a catalytic conversation. We're breaking the ice, and we'd like comrades who we've invited to speak from where they are located in terms of how this perspective resonates with them. Some of them will have to leave us because people, Comrade Nemo, for instance, is in Sharm el-Sheikh, but he's made the time and together with many others. So let's just also appreciate their commitment to this. We're going to kick off then very quickly with the COPAC panel presenting on the key highlights of the document, and then we'll open it up to our discussants. Over to you. Who's going first?
Yes, thank you. Let me just share my screen. I hope my screen is visible for everyone.
Yep. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Vish. So the first strategic perspective document that we are launching, as Vish has said, is Resisting Climate Apartheid and the Ecocidal Capitalism towards a global climate justice bloc for a just world peace, earth democracy, and a climate justice deal for Africa. Now, this perspective document is outlined in the following ways. The first theme we'll look at is climate apartheid and the ecocidal logic of capitalism. We then look at understanding carbon capital's victory and the lock-in of fossil fuels. We look at the failures of the Glasgow COP process and how it has enabled the continuity of the eco-fascist project. And then you look at the maturing contradictions and the systemic disruptions that capitalism is facing. We then look at moving from symbolic climate justice resistance towards a global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements. We then look at what is essential in fighting for survival, looking at the South African Climate Justice Project. And then we look at the challenges that we face to planetize the movement and to end ecocidal capitalism. Now, the system of capitalism has always been plagued by general crises. Between 1870 and 1914, we saw a general crisis of capitalism, one that culminated in imperial conflict, one that led to World War I, with over 10 million people dying. But from that, there were no lessons that were learned from the first general crisis of capitalism, because we saw the same things continuing in the interwar years, which culminated in the Second World War, where about 50 million people died. So this second general crisis of capitalism led to imperial conflict, colonial as well as monopoly interests, and of course, culminating in World War II. The third general crisis in the 1970s was caused by overaccumulation, decline in profit rates, as well as the oil price shocks. Now, what we have seen is that every wave of capitalist expansion has been attempting to enclose the commons, to enclose the natural commons, our land, water, biodiversity, energy, labor, as well as dominating women, dominating nature, and of course, dominating the racial other. Now, this has been a historical process of enclosure, appropriation, and domination. And the fourth general crisis of capitalism, which began around 2007, is generally the crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. But unlike the previous crises of capitalism, this one has the threat of nuclear annihilation, because we've seen that every general crisis of capitalism emanates or culminates and results in war. So the fourth general crisis is unique in that it carries the threat of the annihilation of the human species, the threat of nuclear annihilation. Now we are seeing now a restructuring of the international political economy into a global political economy through the neoliberal class project that began around the 1980s by Reagan and Thatcher and others. Now the transmission and lock-ins of this neoliberal project has come in through structural adjustment programs, through the austerity regime. Now this crisis has had several crises within itself, such as currency collapses, ballooning private as well as public debt, housing market collapses, and widespread precarity in many sectors of the economy. Now, neoliberal reasoning is intensifying surplus value, it's intensifying extraction through the contraction of welfare regimes. We are seeing deindustrialization around the world, precariousness in the labor markets, and we are seeing low unit labor cost manufacturing in China and many parts of the global south. Basically, a global process of commodification and accumulation by dispossession. Now, the neoliberal class project accentuates the existing deep systemic crisis tendencies within capitalism. Now, we are seeing, for example, a systemic tendency between production and reproduction, between nature and society. I mean, we are living in the age of the insect apocalypse, which is one of the threats to the major threats to the global food system. We are seeing a systemic tendency between economic polity as well as institutional systemic divides. Now, these have propelled neoliberalism or monopoly finance capitalism into a phase of authoritarian neoliberalism, where we are seeing thin market democracies which are entrenching the power of transnationalizing capital. Thin market democracies, basically where public participation is undermined. So climate apartheid and the ecocidal logic of capitalism. Now, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, what we saw was vaccine hoarding. We saw countries in the global north refusing basically to share intellectual property rights because they wanted to protect the profits of pharmaceutical companies. Now, the West's response to the climate crisis, to the COVID-19 pandemic is consistent with its response to the climate crisis. It's a logic of climate apartheid which argues that some people, poorer, darker, non-European American people are expendable. Now, those are the people who are least responsible for the climate crisis, but who are paying the highest price for it. Now, the average American, for example, produces about 15.5 tons of carbon per person annually, as compared to a person in sub-Saharan Africa only contributing 0.8 tons per person.
We're having a problem.
Can you hear me, Vish?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. My network must have been.
Okay.
You can still hear me correctly, right?
Yes, please.
Yes,
go
All
ahead.
right, perfect. Now, as I was saying, these are the people who are suffering the most harm from the climate crisis, although they are the ones least responsible for it. And we are seeing that 3.6 billion people in the global south, they face climate harm in 2020. And 118 million poor Africans are going to be exposed to floods, droughts, and extreme heat. Now, despite the climate shocks that Africans are facing, the West continues to invest in fossil fuels in Africa to meet its own needs. And we are seeing investments upwards of $400 billion. And of course, the comprado bourgeoisie, as well as the lumpen proletariat in Africa, are hungry and seeking after these fossil fuels to the detriment of the African continent. Now, there are certain conditions that have led to this, and we have to understand carbon capital's victory, as well as its lock-in of fossil fuels. The increasing use of coal, oil, and gas is exacerbating the climate and ecological rift that we are seeing. The International Energy Agency has said no new investments in oil and gas. It said it included gas before, in order to achieve its full solution of net zero by 2050, but even the IEA has backtracked on gas now because of the Russian war and all that. Now, because carbon capital won and entrenched the use of fossil fuels, now 3 political economic conditions have given rise to this. The first, of course, is the power of the carbon capitalist lobby in the Washington Beltway. we saw in the 90s, the Global Climate Coalition that launched a wave of climate science denialism, discrediting climate science and discrediting climate scientists. Now, many people would assume that climate science denialism began with Trump, but it didn't. There was a foundation that was laid way before Trumpism and MAGA Republicans came into the fore. Now, so the second political condition that gave to this, of course, is the lack of decisive leadership in the UN multilateral process. The failure of imperial leadership has emboldened catch-up development in the global south, led by extractivist development, basically. Now, the third condition that has given rise to this, of course, is the ruling class eco-fascist project, which has congealed and is shaping climate politics, driven by center-right neoliberals who have co-opted the language of climate activists and hard-right neoliberals who outrightly reject climate science and climate change. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Jane Chair.
Thank you so much, Charles. Charles, if you'll just please check your messages. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. All right, I'm now going to speak about part 4 and 5 of this document. So the Glasgow, sorry, let me turn on my camera. The Glasgow UN climate negotiations in November 2021 happened in a context in which COVID-19 was ravaging our societies, and this expression of the revenge of nature was a powerful message to the world. In many ways, it was a prelude to greater pain awaiting our societies as the climate crisis worsens. Despite this context, world leaders and carbon ruling classes came short in terms of their commitments. According to Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, after assessing nationally determined commitments, the world was only on track to cut emissions by 9% by 2030, far short of the necessity of cutting emissions by about half. And we've also seen that global coal use is on the rise, and US crude production will scale to new heights under Biden. Today, the US is the #1 oil and gas producer in the world, and its fossil fuel corporations have made super profits in the midst of crude oil price spikes due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and are positioned as key suppliers to Western Europe. In many countries, massive subsidies to fossil fuel industries are still in place in 2020. In 2020, fossil fuel burning was subsidized to the tune of $5.9 trillion globally, or $11 million per minute. In 2020 and 2021, the South African government provided fossil fuel subsidies to the amount of 172 billion in total, and social costs due to pollution amounted to 550 billion. And despite all the fanfare at the Glasgow COP about finance capital pulling the plug on fossil fuel investments, this is far from what is happening in reality. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, including the Net Zero Banking Alliance, has failed and has funded huge transactions contrary to net zero, with dire implications for lock-ins for coming decades. And there's some numbers there on the slide of who's funding who. In the 6 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted, the world's 60 largest private banks financed fossil fuels with $4.6 trillion, with $742 billion in 2021 alone. So the UN-led COP summit process has failed to stop a looming 1.5 degrees overshoot of planetary temperature. In the next few years, several regions of the world will be devastated by extreme climate shocks. Climate apartheid and injustice is going to intensify while carbon criminals continue using oil, coal, and gas. Next slide, please, Charles. So next we look at maturing contradictions and capitalism's own systemic disruptions. The current debate amongst the global capitalist intelligentsia centers on the end of globalization and the fragmentation of the neoliberal economic order. And we are witnessing various developments that have emerged to challenge liberalized trading systems, such as Donald Trump's big push to decouple the US economy from China, the impact of COVID on supply chains, Brexit, ongoing technological rivalry between the US and China, and the Russian offensive in Ukraine, upending all illusions about energy dependence. And the assumption of open intellectual property and free market trading systems have been shattered as governments rethink degrees of integration, deglobalization, and how to manage systemic risk. However, the remaking of global trading systems is merely the surface expression of the deeper systemic crisis tendencies shaping and limiting the globalized logic of the eco-fascist class project. And these tendencies include financialized inequality and structural unemployment, further entrenching class, race, and gender divides in societies. They're exacerbating the crisis of socio-ecological reproduction. In South Africa, structural unemployment has been over 20% since the 1970s. And today, South Africa's highly globalized and financialized economy has an unemployment rate of 35.3%. And the highest Gini coefficient in the world with 63, and 71% of the wealth owned by 10% of the population. We're also seeing women globally, they're being paid the lowest, they're in the lowest paid work, where 75% of women in developing regions are in the informal economy. Women are doing twice as much unpaid work, and women work longer days than men when paid and unpaid work is counted together. Capitalism is also causing many ecological rifts, including biological disasters such as COVID-19, which are certainly going to increase as natural habitats are destroyed. Sorry, Charles, the slides have jumped to the first one. Thanks. And thank you. The enabling conditions for more zoonotic diseases are in place. This means more destructions, but as a result, we will really need public health systems to be repurposed and strengthened to also face the challenges of worsening climate crisis. Water peak is another major ecological rift being exacerbated by wasteful water use from agriculture, pollution from mining, mismanagement, and according to estimates, water scarcity could impact GDP by up to 14% in 2050, with the Middle East being one of the most affected regions. The climate ecological rift is the most dangerous and is intersecting other systemic crisis tendencies. As more coal, oil, and gas are extracted, the heating and ultimately more intense climate extremes register as shocks. The scientific attribution is clear on this planetary shift. For example, in 2021, the US experienced 20 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters with a price tag of $145 billion. Madagascar, on top of a major drought in 2021, which left 1 million people in food stress, had to deal with 4 tropical cyclones in early 2022, which destroyed about 90% of agricultural crops in some areas, affecting many people. So the crisis of liberal democracies as thin market democracies entrenching the sovereignty of capital are in deep systemic crisis. This is degenerating into authoritarian and neo-fascist politics. The US is driving an agenda for a new Cold War with Russia and China. The Russian invasion of Ukraine reinforces the global food shock, and China has its own financialized accumulation challenges, such as its huge housing bubble bursting. Thanks. I think it's over to Charles for the next section.
Thank you so much, Jane. Next, we look at moving from symbolic climate justice resistance to a global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements. Now, there have been 2 cycles of climate justice resistance from 2004 to 2015, and then from 2015 to 2020. Now, in the first cycle of resistance, climate justice activists were breaking with those who believed that solutions can come from within the COP process. Increasingly, activists were taking to the streets and they were rejecting the false solutions that were emerging from the COP process, and they were demanding systems change, not just climate change. The Cochabamba People's Summit in 2010, for example, was the high point of this cycle of resistance. In 2015, after the world overshot by 1 degrees in planetary temperatures since the Industrial Revolution, a new cycle of climate justice resistance began to emerge. In South Africa, the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign was formed, which later spawned into the Climate Justice Charter movement. In the US, we saw a Standing Rock struggle was grabbing headlines as indigenous communities were resisting oil pipelines in their indigenous lands. Now, the challenge at a global level facing this climate justice of resistance is a shift from symbolic and crowd-centered activism towards constructing a global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements. Now, crucial in building a global climate justice bloc of these alliances is learning from the 20th century internationalism. There are several lessons that can be learned from communist internationalism, for example. There are many lessons we can learn from the Bandung process and the non-alignment movement. And there are many lessons that we can learn, of course, from the Pan-African movement that spawned the organization of African Unit. Now, a global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements does have the potential to emerge and can be constituted through the following convergences. A convergence of national climate justice movements. I mean, there are several national climate justice movements in South Africa, and there are several across many countries of the developing South, several, in fact, in the whole world. It can also converge around vulnerable frontline and island states and coastal communities, many of which are struggling to live because of rising sea levels that threaten their homelands. It can also emerge among countries in climate hotspots, countries in Southern Africa, for example, that are warming at about twice the global rate of temperature increase, countries in the Horn of Africa, and countries around the world which are in climate hotspots. It can also emerge among countries who are devastated by climate shocks, like we saw in Madagascar, like we saw in South Africa with the rain bomb, and recently with the floods in Nigeria, Pakistan, and all around the world. It can also emerge among international climate justice campaigns like food sovereignty, like the divestment campaign, the phasing out of fossil fuels, the Dead for Climate campaign, the End Fossil Fuels campaign, and many other campaigns that are calling for climate justice. It can also converge around anti-austerity resistance forces and forces committed to global just peace through demilitarization and denuclearization. So there's a lot of areas where this global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements has the potential to emerge. Now, the Climate Justice Charter movement in South Africa. Sorry? Sorry, is someone talking?
No, go ahead, Charles. Just wrap up, please.
Oh, thank you. So the Climate Justice Charter movement in South Africa seeks to support the strengthening of these climate justice movements and forces on the African continent and abroad, and is looking to convene a global climate justice council and an assembly with the following struggles and the following demands. The first demand is a global just peace, a call for disbanding of NATO and the Russian withdrawal of Ukraine, a call for denuclearization and demilitarization, and the end of arms sales to the global south, a call for the conversion of all armed forces into special climate emergency public service, a call to build solidarity around the demands of vulnerable island states and countries, internationalizing support for all struggles against fossil fuel extraction, the right to give consent, the right to say no by communities, divestment by banks, pension funds, and investment corporations, a global just peace, of course, that intensifies demand to end subsidies to fossil fuel industries and to reject many of the false solutions and technocratic fixes to the climate crisis. A global just peace, of course, that calls for reparations of climate debt from the global north, support the phase out of fossil fuel treaty campaign, rejecting austerity policies and demanding increasing ecological carbon and progressive taxes on the rich, because the rich have to pay their ecological debt, and also basis for income transfers for all living on planet Earth, targeted climate justice sanctions against countries and corporations that are responsible for climate harm, legal strategies, as well as strengthening the calls to stop external financing. Like what Awanda was talking about at the beginning, the campaign that we're having, we are saying no to the funding of South Africa's just transition program until they commit to no more coal, oil, and gas, because despite the rhetoric, the South African government continues to pursue the gas amendment bill, the upstream petroleum development bill, and continues its obsession with carbon criminality. We are also making a call for earth democracy to deepen solidarities with indigenous communities, to end the exclusionary border regimes that we are seeing, to develop support for a post-UN institutional architecture, to reorganize the world through food sovereignty, and increase support for planetary ecocide law that criminalizes the mass-scale destruction of human and non-human life, and to actively support calls for an earth assembly process, one of the things the CJCM is championing. Now, the possible element of a climate justice deal for Africa, a review of Pan-Africanism, centered on emancipatory feminism, decolonization, particularly African ecological conceptions of being human, and African ecological conceptions of humanity and nature, transformative ideas like the rights of nature from an African perspective, demilitarizing the entire continent, a universal basic income grant for all Africans based on keeping Africa's fossil fuels in the ground and ensuring resilient eco-common systems, a deep just transition plan for Africa, and establishing climate reparations fund for the African continent, and developing early warning systems, especially to vulnerable communities, control of strategic resources and minerals, and going beyond the AU. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Awande Buthelezi.
Thank you, Charles. In fighting for what is essential for survival, the South African Climate Justice Project, the ANC government has not learned any lessons from the climate extremes that have rocked not only this country, but the Southern African region, and also has not placed South Africa on a deep just transition trajectory. This year, in April, KZN province had flash floods killing close to 500 people, 4,000 homes destroyed, 40,000 people displaced. This all comes following the worst droughts in the history of our country that occurred between 2014 and 2021, amongst other climate impacts of tornadoes, flash flooding, landslides in the years of 2017, 2019, and late 2021, preceding the flash flooding of this year. The climate justice charter movement has to be located within the making of global climate justice politics. The second cycle of resistance spawned by 1 degree movements, such as No DAPL or No to the Dakota Access Pipeline, Extinction Rebellions, Sunrise Movement, Fridays for Futures, Indigenous Peoples' Resistance to Amazon Destruction, and the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, which came out of the fight against hunger, high food prices, and the droughts which came across this previous decade. The hunger tribunals with trade unions, faith-based communities, the 2016 drought speak outs, and the development of the People's Food Sovereignty Act, the work done by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign in those years, led to the formulation of the Climate Justice Charter process, which was made up of drought-affected communities, media, trade unions, social and environmental justice organizations, climate scientists, youth, and children. This all led to the drafting of the Climate Justice Charter, which was then launched on August 28th, 2020, and handed over to Parliament in October 16th, with the demand for it to be adopted as per Section 234 of the South African Constitution. The Climate Justice Charter movement is now a rallying point across all progressive civil society, providing greater ideological coherence and a plural vision for what a democratic, eco-socialist South Africa would look like. This is not a blueprint, but an aspirational framework, a signpost of where the country should go if we are to survive a climate-driven world. The Climate Justice Charter is anti-capitalist, emancipatory, feminist, decolonial, and is ultimately about emancipatory ecology. The latter distinguishes it from climate modernizing capitalist approach to deep ecology, while the former points to how green capitalism will not save us and will not solve these systemic crises. Emancipatory feminist perspectives also reject the often misanthropic approach to how all humans are responsible for this crisis, which blatantly ignores the global, historical, gendered, racialized, and socioeconomic inequalities regarding who is to be blamed for this crisis. Charles, next slide. the Climate Justice Charter movement has now entered a new strategic phase of campaigning. As shown in the strategic perspective document titled "What Next for the Climate Justice Charter Movement," a theory of change centered on a climate justice project defending the commons and advancing deep, just transformation through democratic systemic reforms. These democratic systemic reforms represent power from below through democratic plans to deal with the climate crisis and addressing the climate risks that come with it. A strategic transformation through a climate justice political project. The Climate Justice Charter movement is currently developing systemic alternatives in the Charter, which will be translated into policies for a deep, just transition in South Africa. Systemic alternatives in the Charter, which are being transferred into policies such as UBIG, water commons, the rights of nature and natural climate solutions, zero waste, food sovereignty, and socially owned renewable energies, are crucial programmatic and tactical priorities to push forward a climate justice struggle from below. All of these come together in a climate justice deal for South Africa and for Africa. Next slide. Going beyond single issues, symbolic and apocalyptic climatic politics, performative denunciation, shaming, and endless critique is needed to take this climate justice politics to the next level. Climate justice forces have to present concrete answers to accelerate and deepen the transition. And that's what these policy prescriptions and these translation of the Charter's vision into policy will be. Climate justice activism also has to be about trans politics, ensuring workers go beyond narrow economistic politics, ensuring that feminists go beyond women's oppression and environmentalists beyond specific environmental problems. It means building bridges. To build bridges that can also help cement convergences through a common programmatic solidarity. Whilst tackling class and all these multiple oppressions, it must be intersectional and anti-capitalist. Climate justice politics has to go beyond crowd politics, has to go beyond theater outside climate summits and national cloning of international trends. There's no substitution for national movement building. Finally, climate justice forces have to rally and actively support the building of a climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements. More active solidarities have to be built across the global south and the global north. It must accelerate the realization of a global deep just transition, create new planetary emergency institutional architecture, and institute Earth democracy for a world that will be entering into a series of permanent crises and uncertainty.
Thanks. Thanks, Awande. Are you done? Because Nimo has to leave.
I'm done.
Thank you. Yeah, the chat group. So I'm not going to waste time on long bios and so on. Comrade Nemo, we know you have to leave, so please give us your input and your response.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Thanks a lot, comrade. I really have to apologize that I'm jumping away. It's because I'm taking part in an action against militarism in the context of climate change, because militarism and the wars we are seeing in the world today, the conflicts across Africa, they all weaken resilience and render our people more vulnerable to climate impacts. Moreover, we don't have the kind of finance that is needed to tackle the climate impacts that we're seeing daily, whereas much money is being invested in warfare and militarism. Generally, almost all the countries in the NATO bloc have increased their military budgets. We've seen the war in Ukraine pushing shortfall from the supply from Russia. And world today, the geopolitical system is how we need a charter such as the one that is being discussed today. We need it not just for South Africa, but for the entire continent and indeed across the world. The COP itself has become a clearly neo-colonial construct. And so we do need this kind of counter COPs and charters to, one, legitimize the COP itself and replace the failed system. The action promoted by the COP, the 4 solutions, including, I mean, they're very ecocidal, as you've mentioned already in the intro to this meeting, and they're all promoting environmental racism. This is what makes extractive activities even worse in Africa, because extraction don't consider the planet, neither do they consider the people and communities that are being impacted. The 4 solutions being promoted by African nations is really very outstanding, astonishing. At the present COP in Egypt, African nations are promoting the creation of a new carbon market system, because governments think that getting money from carbon will kickstart some economic progress or whatever. I don't know what they're thinking. Well, it really shows that there must be a mindset shift on the continent. That our leaders must understand the fundamental causes of climate change, which includes colonial extraction, colonial exploitation, and so that we can find ways to tackle the challenge and not just to fall into the pit that brought us to where we are in the first instance. Article 6.4 has a new definition that is being debated at this conference of parties, which truly speaking is actually conference of polluters, and is the definition of carbon removal includes the storage of carbon in ocean reservoirs. And know that the struggle of communities, fishers, and activists in South Africa has so far kept away the claws and the appetites of oil and gas companies trying to explore and extract gas on the South African coast. But if this definition kicks in and is adopted, it's going to give the oil companies and gas companies a license to open up those oil wells and gas wells, and that will be a big setback for the health of the ocean, the economy of our communities, our cultural bases, our everything related to the environment to be damaged by this new definition of carbon removal, which is driven by, obviously, by the fossil fuel industry. I mean, there are other things about geoengineering which are all so dangerous and would deepen the geopolitical power inequalities that favors polluters and the government that back them. Now, finally, let me just say that maybe not finally, almost finally, the massive presence of fossil fuel lobbies at the present COP in Egypt is astonishing. The number of lobbies has exceeded the numbers that we saw at Glasgow last year, which shows that the COP itself is getting more and more grabbed by the industry. And I tell you, this COP would not come up with anything that would be worth celebrating by those who are already victims of climate change. And my conclusion about the COP is that the COP is lost and damaged, and completely. So the loss and damage discussion is a metaphor for what is the fact, that the COP itself is lost, is damaged, and it should either be replaced or grossly, totally redefined. And right now, rather than asking for, we should ask for one, a truly just transition that takes care of the needs of the people, the needs of labor, the needs of not just changing one energy system to another, but a complete system change. And we also, instead of asking for loss and damage, we should be demanding the payment of a climate debt, which has historical basis and is continuing even as we speak. This is what we should be asking for. But shockingly, African governments are out here with empty bowls begging for tokens. It's something that should be completely denounced, and which is not what we need. We need true justice, and justice must come with dignity. And the ideals captured in this charter that's been presented so eloquently is something that we have to embrace, promote, and bring to life. So thank you so much for giving me this quick opportunity. I go to the COP to denounce militarism, and of course, I'll share the ideas that are picked up from this meeting. Amandla.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Come forward with you as we deepen this process and dialogue. And feel free to leave. We know you have a commitment. I'm going to call Varsha from the Progressive International. I know she also has time constraint. But again, thank you for making the time to join us. Varsha, over to you for your response.
Thank you, Vishwas. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm also having my own fair share of internet troubles. Okay.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much. And really wonderful to hear Nemo, of course, also a comrade from the Progressive International. Always lovely to see him and to see so many friendly faces here. So I'll keep my comments brief. I was thinking about the topic today, and I was really interested that peace was a part of the kind of broader discussion, which I know isn't often the case for climate conversations. And I was thinking, if peace, is really about living without disturbance, for me, few things are more urgent than the fact that close to 2.7 billion people in the world today are hungry, right? 2.7 billion. I remember first hearing that number and just kind of not being able to wrap my head around it, because it isn't about food shortage. It isn't that we can't make enough food for the entire world. But there's still billions of people who can't access it because they can't afford it, or we're producing food that's going to waste. I'm speaking to you today from Mysore, which is a small city in southern India, where thousands of farmers have just gathered today to discuss the very serious challenges facing kind of agriculture in India at this time. I mean, this year alone, as you've seen, we've had a scorching summer, sweltering heat waves, temperatures that were regularly above 40 degrees that stunted, damaged crops across the country. But it's not just heat. All of us know it's water depletion, it's water shortage that's been affecting farmers to the extent that we have at this moment something close to 30 suicides daily. There are 30 farmers daily that are dying by suicide because they can't produce food anymore, and there are debt traps that are keeping them in this kind of in extreme poverty. So in that sense, we've talked about nature's revenge. I think what's going on right now is also, in that sense, it's a kind of war, right? It's also cruel war where billions of people are forced to kind of be at war with their own lives, forcing their bodies to work through starvation, to care for their families so that they can live to see another day. My comrades have pointed out that often when I give these speeches, I say things like, it's stunning to me that more people aren't talking about this. But I think when it comes to the food crisis and when it comes to climate, actually everyone is talking about it, right? It makes the front pages all the time, from the Wall Street Journal to the Economist to the New York Times, everywhere. And all of our political leaders are talking about it. But it's under their very leadership that this genocidal project, as the team from CJM kind of laid out, is being waged against the third world. Having said this, I think the overwhelming feeling that I have at this juncture, and even as I read the incredible document put forth by the Climate Justice Charter, I couldn't help but feel like we've been here before, right? Think about the 1970s, rocketing energy prices that rob families of light, heat, and fuel, droughts and floods that drive displacement and famine, soaring inflation that swells the cost of living for our communities and swells the cost of borrowing for our governments. In short, right, this is not our first poly crisis, as again the document mentions. But back in the 70s, when the nations of the third world, having kind of just won their independence from colonial powers, were confronted with their own series of grave crises, they did come up with an answer: the vision for a new international economic order, or the NIEO. And I think this is an idea that both I personally, but we at the Progressive International are quite excited about, because the NIEO back then did at least have seemingly a vision for and address the very sources of the poly crisis that I think we're facing today as well, right? So you think about the soaring cost of food. The NIEO urged global action against food shortages, both real and artificial, enabled countries to import food without running down foreign exchange, assurance of global access to fertilizers. Think about the severity of sovereign debt. Call for cancellation, call for IMF special drawing rights, called against foreign extraction of oil, metal, minerals, so on and so forth, and called for full permanent sovereignty of every state over its resources. Critical technology, very, very clear kind of rules against hoarding of intellectual property by rich countries, demands for tech transfer, and real international cooperation and trade. And I think these energies very much exist today. I don't want to overstate the possibility for something like a new international economic order again, but when we hear someone like Amir Motley from a hurricane-ravaged Barbados who's calling for a complete reform of the global financial system, or you hear ideas for a sovereign wealth fund from a resource-rich country like Namibia, following in the footsteps of course, Angola, Botswana, and Libya and others who've had sovereign wealth funds, who are trying to kind of, critical effort against extractivism and to keep Africa's wealth within the continent. Or if you look at what we're hearing from the pink tide, the new pink tide in Latin America, lithium capital, where governments of Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile are coming together to say, we'll only trade lithium together and actually create an association so we can share knowledge and experiences. I think these ideas are really exciting to me, not just, of course, from states, from people's movements like the Cochabamba People's Movement, the Food Sovereignty Movement, from which the Climate Justice, the South Africa Food Sovereignty Movement, from which this very group, came to be. I think that's precisely the spirit of unity, solidarity, and creativity that I think animated the new international economic order back then, and I think it's what will animate this new order that we could build today. So what I'm very excited about in the strategic perspective is that CJM provides this answer by calling it the global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, peoples, and movements that has the potential to emerge. I absolutely agree, especially because as COP has made it very, very clear that the people of the global south, I think, simply cannot wait, right? So the great powers to reorder the world around them, whether we think of Bandung, we think of Cairo, we think of Dakar, we formed an online movement behind the principles of peace and sovereignty. In New York City, we had the UN Declaration established for a new international economic order. So, and I think that's exactly what we need today as well, especially because things are very similar but different in one crucial way, because it's no longer just a matter of social justice. In this age of escalating climate crisis, it is very, very clear that a new order is a necessity for our survival. So I'm very happy to be part of these discussions and hopeful that we're going to get ideas for how to make the climate justice bloc a reality. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Varsha. And we know you also have constraints. You have to be at another meeting. So yeah, we can release you and you can leave whenever you have to. We are pressed for time. I wasn't sure if Samantha has joined us, Jane or Awande or Charles. I know she's in a workshop, Women's having their strategic planning, but she definitely wanted to be here. But I suppose she'll join us time permitting on her side. In the meantime, Bill, are you able to speak? I was just worried about your connection. Are you safe, a reliable connection, Ariel? I can't hear anything. Move on. Kumi, over to you. Kumi. Go ahead.
Hi, folks. Thank you, everyone. Good to see some old comrades and some new comrades participating in this conversation. Firstly, let me just say that the work that's been presented is one that finds favor with the Africans Rising for Justice, Peace, and Dignity, the African-wide Pan-African social movement that I represent at this call today. I want to applaud all those that have contributed to a very sound, clear framework that has been presented. Having said that, I want to use the remainder of my time, and please tell me to shut up, Vish, if I go over. I want to use my time to reflect on the wisdom that came out of Louis Althusser in the 1970s, when he made a distinction between the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus. Because I want to just focus my comment on not diagnosing the deep crisis we are in, which has been well done. I want to ask the question, what is to be done? So, one of the mistakes that activism makes is believing that the repressive state apparatus is our biggest challenge. But actually, in reality, it is the framework for communications and media, funding of arts and culture, education, religion, and so on, which actually is a more pernicious and stifling control over our ability to move agendas forward. So right now, the challenge for us is, how do we take this kind of thinking frameworks and so on and take it to the people that need to be part of the conversation? I shared this with a few comrades in Africans Rising, and well, the bits that I had at that time, and they said, this sounds great, but most of our constituency won't be able to engage with us. So what I'd like to propose as a very practical thing, if we are to get serious about building the kinds of broad-based mass movements that we need to do, because it's clear we're living in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we do in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future we have, or whether we will have a future at all. And within that context, I think that the notion of urgency needs to also inform our own practice, right? And I know it does to a large extent, but there's one piece that I want to propose here, and that is, I think we need to, the Climate Justice Charter movement, which has inspired me personally over the last year since it's been around, we would be well advised, I think, to reach out to comrades in the adult education movement and to start working with them on how do we make this knowledge more accessible to a much larger constituency of people. Because at the moment, I feel that we run the risk always of creating another echo chamber where we convince ourselves how correct our political position is, and it will be correct, right? But where we're not able to convince large enough numbers of people who are in the front lines of climate impacts to be able to shift things forward. The last point I wanted to make, if I can move off this, to just reflect on what, sorry. Sorry.
Dorothy, can you mute Dorothy? Dorothy, can you mute? Jane, can you mute Dorothy?
Moment.
Sorry about that. So, Nemo's reflections on the COP, right, which I share. I mean, just to be clear, the largest delegation in the Glasgow COP was not even the UK government that had 310 delegates, but it was the fossil fuel industry with 515 delegates, right, or something like that. That's as absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous having a global conference, and the largest delegation to the conference is the alcohol industry. But the difficulty is, and that's the reason why Nemo is there. Warts and all, this defective negotiating space is what we have, and we have to try to push it as far as it can go for now. But on the other hand, what I think is important is for us to do what Nemo is saying, is try to imagine other ways in which we can organize intergovernmental processes. And therefore, I want to conclude my comments by saying that the idea of a climate bloc is a promising one. What I would urge, though, is in the way one tries to move that forward, that we look at existing efforts and, like, for example, forging an alliance with the intergovernmental group of countries called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, for example, in terms of governments that would be likely to sing. Not all of them would be, because on the economic structure and systemic change, some of them would be too hesitant to. But also another initiative like the Fossil Free Treaty Initiative, which now has Vanuatu and Tuvalu as two governments in the camp now pushing and so on. So that would be another recommendation that I would make. And thank you so much, everybody. And I hope I didn't take too much of time. And once again, I really, really want to express deep appreciation to all the folks that did this work. I think our analysis is sound. I think what now we also need support on is how do we analyze what is to be done in terms of shifting things forward in an organizational, in a mobilizational, in a consciousness raising sense. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kumi, for those comments. Dorothy, I know you're having some trouble and you are on the streets in Egypt right now, in Sharm el-Sheikh. Do you want to come in quickly, Dorothy?
Yes, okay.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Vish. And hello, everyone. Well, I'm outside, I'm inside the venue, but it's impossible to get a quiet space inside the negotiation. So I thought that it would be better to speak here. I'm near the registration, so that's why I'm outside. But I'm in the perimeter. I think what I would just wanted to share as well is that speaking about the negotiation, this is the 27th conference of parties, and from the reports mentioned, and then also from those comments being shared by G77 and China country delegations, they are getting more and more frustrated, which is understandably so, because it seems that the key theme of loss and damage and adaptation finance, we may not see it here. They're saying that during the negotiation and when the southern countries were pushing hard on climate finance, the northern countries were not really that supportive. Many are quiet actually, but then on the sideline they were pushing what is more close to the dialogue that was decided in Glasgow, which means wait for 3 years and wait until 2024-25 for that to happen. So many are already saying that, look, we could no longer wait while the developing countries are already getting impacted, and some are even getting close to the impossibility of adaptation because, sorry, my phone is moving a lot. That some countries may not even be able to do adaptation. Like you look at what's happening in Pakistan. More and more climate-related incidents are happening, and at a stronger intensity and also frequency. Many countries were saying that while the North is behaving like there's time when actually there's no time. Another interesting feature that was mentioned, apart from what Kumi mentioned, is that Vanuatu also proposed that in next month's meeting of the UN General Assembly, they want the UN to have like a process check whether the COP process is actually delivering, which is quite interesting. And it seems that they will discuss that in December. I think another, so that will be worth watching. My main point that also that I wanted to say, apart from the problem of equity, the problem of like pushing the goalpost, is of course finance. Again, I'll go back to that because the litmus test here is whether the loss and damage mechanism will happen, and also if there's more money on adaptation. The thing is, many of the rich countries had been committing and saying, especially on the leaders meeting, that they have increased their commitments, but in reality it's not really that much. The UK promised tripling its finance on climate, but in reality there's no new money in those commitments that Rishi Sunak mentioned. And the worrying part as well is that if we remember the Glasgow finance action on net zero, they came up with a guideline here. They publicized the guidelines here, and that guideline, although it's not really strictly in the negotiation, but that guideline is what the private finance, what the insurers will follow. It may not be as bad as we were mentioning, but it's there. So and then there's no mechanism to check, although they were urged that when it comes to their investment, they have to monitor that. Hello, there's a discussion in way back in Glasgow about fossil fuels, but they could just disregard that and continue funding fossil fuel projects. So this is for almost end of first week, and that all the subsidiary body meeting already reported. It's not very promising, to be honest. Although, yeah, of course, the unity in the southern countries are getting stronger because they're all equally frustrated. And we could still see by next week, maybe something hopeful will happen. But I think we just continue on struggling. We just continue on fighting, doing the hard fight. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if the sound is not ideal.
We heard you. We heard you
So
loud
we
and
are
clear.
here in the in outside here.
Yes. Lovely, lovely to have you, Dorothy. Dorothy worked to build the Climate Justice Coalition in the build-up to the Glasgow Summit in the UK. And thank you for your input, Dorothy. Because of time
Bye.
constraints and so on, we're going to bring in Roland Nigam, followed by Ariel. So Roland, please, over to you.
Thank you, Vish.
Roland, are
Yes,
you
yes,
there?
can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you and good
Yes.
afternoon. I think we start from a very specific premise that the global capitalist hegemony that we have today started off on the principle by obviously empire that those who lived in areas of the world that they did not really know belonged to them, and they could use these people and their lands and their commodities as they saw fit. This is the benediction that Pope Nicholas V gave acceded to, that is slavery and then colonialism, and that has led us today to the kind of system where we have the extractive system, the system of supermarketization, increase in platform economies, increase in the fourth industrial revolution, which, like Achille Mbembe has said, will reduce human beings to artifacts. And so the reason why the fossil fuel, the fossil capital hegemony is getting stronger is because we have been living in this dynamic. And like Kumi said earlier, too often we focus too much on nation states and forget the fact that nation states have ceded a lot of their authority and territory to corporations, which largely control the kind of information that we consume, the kind of lifestyles that we live, and the kind of houses that we live in, and so on. And so all of that needs to be relitigated if we are to successfully dismantle these systems in order to move to low carbon economies. And so now to COP. It is very difficult seeing what I've just described to envision a good outcome next week. And like Dottie said before me, and Nemo as well, and Charles alluded to that, about $500 billion have flown into Africa in the past year alone. Why do we have $500 billion flowing into Africa? Because following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, suddenly Europe needs about 155 billion cubic feet of gas. And Africa is positioning itself as Europe's energy station. Countries like Senegal, for example, already have put their foot forward to accede to a similar plan that was given to South Africa at COP26. Other countries are ready to follow suit. During the second day of COP, there was a panel on hydrogen, and Namibia, South Africa, and a number of other African countries positioned themselves to start producing hydrogen, which will be exported to Europe. And so all these things make for a very difficult picture. But of course, we have solutions. And the first solution I will say is that one of the things that we notice at COP is that it is really not just only very colonial, but also very middle class and so on. And the reason for that is because in many of our countries, we often say that people who live in the rural areas, people who do not have a certain type of education, do not understand climate change, which is not very true at all. And so I believe that the building blocks need to start in our communities, understanding the current impacts of climate change, understanding the impacts of drought in small communities, understanding the fights in some communities where, frankly, the colonial power is not the US hegemon. The colonial power in those places is South Africa, is India, is China, and so on. And so we need to start bringing in these communities and understanding their struggles and translating those struggles into the political sphere. The second thing that we need to do is to try and, sorry, there's an airplane flying over. The second thing that we need to do is to try and work together with partners on different globes for a new internationalism. This new internationalism should recognize the importance of communities in other countries on our well-being. And finally, like Nemo said, obviously, COP is lost and damaged. And how do we fix it? The reason most activists who criticize COP are still at COP is because no country on its own can solve or can cap warming at 1.5 degrees. We need the entire planet to do that. And for that, we have to work together. But then there is a possibility to relitigate this organization. And that can only happen if we start in our countries, within trade unions, within local organizations, and bringing that fight in political systems in our countries, and then using that energy to try and force the UN body to overhaul this system. And why not, on a final note, we have been talking about the first eco-socialist international. That is something that everyone is looking forward to, and we should be trying to make that happen wherever we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Roland from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I'm going to hand over to Ariel Derringer from the Indigenous Action Network, fighting fracking, tar sands in Canada. So over to you, Ariel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm also in the COP venue space, trying to find a quiet corner and reliable internet, which is very difficult here. I think, first off, I just want to echo also a lot of the speakers here around how what was presented was just so articulate and so needed and refreshing, particularly after spending the last week here in the UN spaces, where we're seeing the negotiations really focusing around loss and damages, climate finance, and Article 6, which are carbon market mechanisms. And also looking at who are negotiating the parameters of what this all looks like. Who is entitled to loss and damages? Where is climate finance going? And what are these carbon market solutions going to look like? Our market mechanisms for addressing the crisis look like? I'm going to quote Kumi from last year at the end of COP26 in Glasgow, where he stated, COP26 was male, pale, and stale. And that continues to ring true here, where we're seeing the same sort of colonial powers and white like white voices from white colonial imperial states driving the negotiations, where it's become a sort of a power struggle between human rights approaches versus economic and market-based approaches. And the big question that came up with the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, which I'm a big part of, a part of as a North American representative, is that who are these people here saving the planet for? Who are they saving it for? They're not saving it for people. They're not saving it for Indigenous peoples. They're not saving it for humans anymore. What we're seeing is that this is purely an economic negotiations platform where they're trying to find ways to greenwash industries so they can continue business as usual, so corporations can continue rearing record-breaking profits in the billions of dollars. And despite the fact that there were commitments to over $100 billion US within climate financing, we've not seen that met. In addition, there's no indicators of how that's actually going to reach communities and those that are at the forefronts of this. There's also a pledge to for $1.7 billion for Indigenous peoples within the climate finance sector. Again, nothing. All of it gets lost in the bureaucracy just so that they can continue business as usual. And the need for a climate justice movement outside of these spaces, an alternative to these sort of colonial driven spaces, male, pale, and stale spaces, is this alternative space, venue. We need to be articulating a movement that is driven from the grassroots. As an Indigenous person who has seen first and foremost the impacts of the oil and gas sector with the Alberta tar sands in my traditional territory, how it's wreaked havoc on our water systems, our ecological systems, and our culture and the rights of our communities, and how that very same industry that has been directly implicated in the degradation to the quality of life and health and the environment of our people is also it's also contributing to rising greenhouse gas emissions, which is exacerbating the climate crisis that we're feeling on top of the environmental crisis. And I can feel the connections to my brothers and sisters globally that are being forced to believe that these are the only sectors that are economically viable, that we have to save these sectors in order to save the planet. We really must be coming together as a global movement with labor, Indigenous rights, people of color, poor communities to demand justice for all of us, because we can no longer afford to be a part of the status quo. So my role here in COP isn't to try to uplift the structures and the agreements that are being negotiated here, but rather to interrupt those narratives and to really demand more. And this really gets to this ideology around what is decolonization. How do we decolonize these spaces? And the presentation earlier was really that picture. That's that first step of how we go forward. Being a part of the Indigenous caucus here within these spaces has been a part of indigenizing, which is really representation and visibility. But representation and visibility is not about changing. It's not about systemic change. It's just about representation to interrupt the status quo. But we simultaneously need to be building those alternative pathways that we can utilize instead of trying to fix the system that's broken. A friend of mine, Nick Estes, was asked a question around how do we fix these economic systems? Can't we just like tweak what we currently have to make it work for us? And his response was, you were not going to wake up tomorrow morning and hug the murder out of capitalism just as much as we can't hug the genocide out of colonialism. We have to be moving towards alternatives that embody centering human rights and Indigenous rights and the knowledge of those that have those connections to the lands and territories at the center of this work. And I'm just so moved by the movement that we're starting to see pick up and be articulated, not only within these spaces, but within the global movement for climate justice for all communities. The liberation of my community in Northern Alberta, in so-called Canada, is directly tied to the liberation of my brothers and sisters in Africa, in the Pacifica, in the global South over and over again. I am not willing to be a participant in division and conquer with carbon markets that try to divide our communities and pit us against each other. I would rather be a part of alternative movements that try to find ways to coalesce our collective struggles to become unified for a better tomorrow. Thank you, and Masicho.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and we understand your constraints as well. Your message, like others, was very powerful. We are now going to Samantha. Unfortunately, can't make it from Warman. She's in a workshop right now, and she wanted to be here, but unfortunately she can't, and so can't Pablo Solon. But in the meantime, we have others to give us a response. We now have David Kenman from the former anti-apartheid movement Action for Southern Africa. Over to you, Kevin, for your message.
Thank
David.
you. First of all, I should explain that I'm the Vice Chair of AXA UK, as well as the Vice Chair of AXA Scotland. And what we actually have to consider is how we can actually deliver the solidarity that's required. It's quite clear that the global north is responsible for the carbon emissions causing the climate crisis. And it's quite clear that the global south are the people on the receiving end. At COP26, the UK government promised South Africa millions of pounds to assist in the just transition from fossil fuels to carbon neutral fuels. And so far, only about 120,000 of that has been made available, which is obviously minuscule. The problem, of course, is that the UK government went into complete meltdown after COP26 for reasons which are too complicated to go into. It has, however, led to a difficulty because this Truss government, within the 6 weeks that they were there, actually crashed the UK economy and caused the pound to lose quite a lot of value. And this led to an increase in the feeling in the Conservative Party that loss and damage payments should not be made available. And this is going to be an argument that we are going to have. The situation with the Scottish government is different. They have set up a loss and damage fund, and it is a significant amount of money for what's available from the Scottish budget. It is, however, quite minuscule in terms of what is required across the whole of the global south. We can argue quite legitimately that Scotland has a long connection with South Africa, especially the Eastern Cape, stretching back to the mid-18th century when Scottish sailors were shipwrecked and became the ancestors of the Amascotia. The most important link, however, is that Lovedale College was founded by the Glasgow Missionary Society, and its first principal was the Reverend William Govan, after whom Govan and Becky was named. Lovedale went on to grow into Fort Hare University, and amongst its students, apart from Govan himself, were Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo. So we can argue this historic link, but so can other places. So there is one issue on which we have to be quite clear. The Zondo Commission requires action. The whole of state capture and corruption poses a problem because we and you, as especially the South African government, will actually have to show that money paid to South Africa to cope with loss and damage will not go into the pockets of private individuals, that it will not be stolen. And that is something that we can do something about partly in the UK. We can take on those companies that were actually assisting with the looting of the South African treasury. We already have with companies like Bell Pottinger and Bain and Company. And we can make sure that they actually have to face up to the consequences of what they did. But we need that action in South Africa as well. So our position is quite simply that we are going to argue for loss and damage payments, and we will actually continue with that struggle, but we need the help of people in South Africa to ensure that the whole issue of state corruption is dealt with so that we can actually turn around to our governments in UK and in Scotland, and say the issue is being dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And your message is noted, and we're definitely going to take it on board. We now have David, I think it's Roland. Rob Callender, sorry, from Debt for Climate. Over to you, Rob.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Hi. So I'm here representing Debt for Climate, which is a global movement that came, I'm here in the UK, but it was started in the anti-fracking and the labor movements of Argentina. And since then it's moved and it's grown to many countries across the global south and the global north as a sort of real wave of, and a real materialization of that global climate justice block that you've been talking about. So the name is Debt for Climate for obvious reasons. I think it's a huge demand, the total cancellation of global south debt in order to fight climate change. It's a really important one, I think, as well. And I was really interested reading this document because, you know, when we talk about capitalism, I would agree with some of the criticisms. I myself didn't go to a university. I've read a lot of books since then, but I also, you know, sometimes find the language very difficult. Whereas when I'm on the street, I'm an activist, have been for a long time in many movements, but got very involved in economic and social and racial justice in the UK a while ago. And something that really resonated with me was debt. Debt really cuts across not only sort of geopolitical lines and global lines, but it also cuts across class lines in a way that's really abundantly clear here in the UK, as well as globally. So a really important thing here when we're having conversations and conversations that have moved from just being about environmental and local ecological issues, which I think is also something that you mentioned in your document, to talking about the global picture and how you create this internationalist solidarity. Debt is a vital issue. Within countries, debt is a massive transfer of wages away from working class wages and generally waged work to the people with capital in the first place. And you see this globally. So it's from the resource of your labor is moved from you to the people with credit, the banks, and that whole capitalist system, which was invented. We should remember that it was invented. It's not an indigenous system. It's not a system that was you know, something that came without an inequality that wanted to perpetuate itself. So that happened, but also it happens globally, clearly. So much of the climate crisis is fueled by the massive debt crisis. When you are in debt, what do? You have to exploit whatever it is you can exploit. I mean, globally and locally in your person, you know, that's everything. You're going to work harder and harder and harder, even if you have no energy left to live or reproduce yourself. You're going to work harder to pay off those debts, even when the system is against you and when those debts are no fault of your own. In a global perspective, those debts are historical, those debts are colonial, those debts are racist debts. And those debts are still, the legacy of those debts is still what's being paid. And so you see a massive transfer from the resource-rich countries to the financially credit and capital-rich countries in the global north. And if, you know, with the work of Jason Hickel, that financial flow looks like $30 for every $1 that goes from the global north to the global south. $30 is going from the south to the north in unequal transfer of wealth. And the lubricant and the slide and the way in which that transfers is through this global debt mechanism. And we're seeing that talked about more and more and more. Something that was said a long time ago, it's been echoed again and again. It was said once by Stokely Carmichael, but it's been said again since then, is that debt is the knee on the neck or the boot on the neck of the global south. And I find, you know, when we're talking about loss and damage payments, we're talking about other things, those payments can't really make sense within this global debt architecture. And because what you're doing, you know, you've still got the boot on the neck, but then you're giving a hand, and so that just makes things worse. And obviously, this is part of a tradition that incorporates you know, a lot of thinking for a long time. But why Debt for Climate is really interesting is because it has come out of these labour movements. It's come from the global south, and it's resonating with global climate movements also in the global north. It's, you know, part of that Occupy and anti-globalization wave that happened in the 2000s. The original Jubilee debt campaign as well looked at very similar things, but we're talking about an acceleration of it. And something just as something I want to say here, we have a mobilization in February that is the anniversary of the London Agreement, which was when Germany had its debt cancelled, an example of how debt cancellation can happen. And really needs to happen at this moment. While we're talking about all of these issues sort of coming together, I think that what was said at the end of the document that we were asked to comment on about national movements, I think is a really interesting thing to lean on here, because we need to build these decision-making structures in a way that resonates locally. And the things that resonate locally are, you know, is very diverse. But I think when we're talking about building this global climate justice bloc, I'd really like us, I think it's really important that we find a way of being internationalists and coming together, and at the same time, having a strong community building focus in all of our places in the global north and the global south, and creating a narrative that springs from community, from the relationship between community and the land back movement. Obviously is really important for that, but it's a very forgotten memory in many countries in the global north. But it's going to be absolutely vital for creating the groundswell that's needed, because that knee on the neck of the global south is a British knee, it's a European knee, it's an American knee. That's where the private creditors are. That's where the great voting and veto power of the IMF and the World Bank are. So Debt for Climate has grown out of these labour and debt movements and the anti-fracking movement in Argentina, and it's now going across the globe. And all I would say to everyone always is we need, all these movements need practical application. What we say in these rooms, and a lot of us always feel like, oh, we're in these rooms again, we've heard it before. You know I've even heard that said already today. When it comes to applying these things on the ground, it suddenly becomes very granular. And having worked in Extinction Rebellion, lots of other different movements, working in solidarity with other movements as well, when you're starting to try and apply that on the ground, what you realize is what we really need is more people to consistently be practically involved in creating their communities and working on something. And for us, a vision that can guide us and can keep us going is global debt cancellation for the global south, because who owes who and who is responsible is vital here, and we need it for climate action.
Thank you so much, Rob. Our final speaker for this session is Quincy Saul from Eco Socialist International. Over to you, Quincy. Quincy, are you there? Quincy? Quincy Saul? You're having a problem. Quincy, can you hear me? We'd like your input. Okay, in the meantime, Jane, can you just read out the message from the Bishop Mkombu from SAFC, please, the Southern African Faith-Based Communities.
Sure, thanks, Vish. Yeah, he had to leave early. Vish, also just to mention that when we tried to chat to Quincy at the beginning of this call, he was having issues. So I suspect he's still having issues. Yeah, Bishop Mchombo from SAFC, but also the bishop in Eastern Zambia of Anglican Church. He had to leave early, but he was with us for the beginning. And he just left a message in the chat, which I will read. So he says, from the faith point of view, failing to care for creation is a slap on the Creator. Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said in 1929, it becomes ever clearer that climate change is the greatest challenge that we and future generations face. It's our sacred duty to protect the natural world we've so generously been given, as well as our neighbors around the world who will be first and worst affected. Without swift, decisive action, the consequences of climate change will be devastating. That's it, Vish.
Thank you, Jane. Quincy, are you back? Are you able to make your input? If not, we're going to have to move on. So a big thank you to all our respondents and for a very stimulating engagement, for kind of putting a whole set of issues into perspective. But this is just the start of this conversation. So we will be continuing this engagement as this process unfolds. Jane, I'm handing over now to the next panel. I don't know who's chairing that.
Thanks, Vish.
Who's that?
It's Natalie.
Okay, Natalie, over to you.
Okay, so this panel is all the documents that are being presented. So the first one is being presented by Awande, and it's the ANC-led alliance and state is the main obstacle to a deep, just transition towards people and worker-driven just transitions for climate justice deal and climate emergency state. Over to you, Awande.
Thank you, Natalie. I will be sharing my screen. Strategic Perspective Document 2, the ANC-led alliance and the state is the main obstacle to a deep, just transition towards people and worker-driven just transitions for a climate justice deal and climate emergency state. So in this document, we go across 6 main key focus areas. Beyond the introduction, we begin with the question of ecocidal capitalism in South Africa, its legacy and its history, the ANC Alliance Class Project, post-apartheid state formation, reproducing accumulation through ecocide and carbon capitalism, the general crisis of socio-ecological reproduction in South Africa, key conjunctural moments, and then going towards a people-driven climate justice deal and climate emergency state for South Africa. So the ANC-led alliance as a political force has obviously been the most dominant post-apartheid force in this country. There were many high expectations with regards to the need for serious transformation and the potential for transformation to occur following the brutalization and dehumanization that occurred in the apartheid and the colonial era. But the politics of polarization that the ANC-led alliance has unleashed threatens the future of our country. It has not stood up to this historic task that has been given to transform this country. And the strategic argument that the Charter movement The strategic argument that the Climate Justice Charter movement puts forward is very simple, as been outlined in the previous presentation, but honing it in with regards to this perspective in relation to the failure of the ANC-led alliance is that the climate crisis affects everything, and therefore it requires addressing through a plurivision of the Charter and the transformative manner and alternatives that it puts forward to provide a livable, just and safe, deeply democratic country. In New South Africa, beyond the ANC-led alliance and state nightmares also certainly possible. The climate crisis is worsening. That has to be taken into consideration in how we address these historic crises that the ANC-led alliance has failed to address. And climate extremes are also now the reality, not only to the, according to the climate science, but as we've seen in terms of the experience of people in this country. In addition to that, carbon emissions continue to rise. South Africa and Southern African region heating at twice the global average of the climate hotspot. So we're looking at 3 degrees of warming with the 1.5 degrees overshoots, either in this decade or sooner. And also, as the previous speakers have spoken about with regards to the failures of the UN-led COP process, South Africa, in addition to that, has not really taken mitigation and adaptation seriously. And the question of a deep, just transition is in serious trouble. The just aspect of that transition, I think we will get a transition, but whether it would be deep or just is still up in the air, and certainly not something we can bank on with the current ANC-led alliance. In addition to that, also, it's engaged in performance of policy gestures about climate change. And I think if you've been following the COP process and how South Africa has played a role in this COP and the last COP, you can see that that's even extended into the international sphere. But in addition to that, that is also in addition to its continued expansion with regards to a carbon-centric extractivist approach, and the accumulation, the needs or the demand for accumulation for the emergent Black capitalist class. So the ANC state has been an important facilitator also within the global power structure. We have given it legitimacy from a global South perspective. And within the South African context, that has been within the era of the Mandela's presidency with regards to the need for systemic transformation being watered down to the neoliberal structure of rainbowism, the Mbeki era with his African Renaissance, taking that neoliberal agenda and framework to the regional and continental level, and then obviously the era of Jacob Zuma, which gave us the connection and the marriage of green neoliberalism and the RET resource nationalism. And then now we're currently in the era of Cyril Ramaphosa, who's expanded and continues this SA neoliberalism brand with the anti-corruption fight. So the ecocide question, ecocidal capitalism in South Africa and Africa. So ecocide referring to the mass scale destruction of human and non-human life historically, and the way in which it's been a part of the logic of capitalist accumulation. It's an aspect of capitalist accumulation historically. It's obviously rooted in the colonial context, in the colonial encounter, in the colonial moment. You've seen this in genocide, species extinction that has occurred during the colonial process, slavery, biodiversity loss, super exploitation, ecosystem destruction, the appropriation of resources and industrial scale violence, including war that occurred in the colonial period. It's based on and built on a foundation of conquest of nature, people, women, and the use of technological process for Euro-American supremacy, and it has been destroying the planet. Just because we've moved into a quote-unquote post-colonial era, that foundation, that legacy has continued onwards, and it's processed the logic of this capital accumulation, which began then, has moved into this period, and it's obviously leading to the destruction of our planet. And in the South African sense, it has a particular historical sequence, the way in which it's gone about. This accumulation occurred through ecocide, which required and occurred through the enclosure of the commons, through the colonialism of the Dutch and the British, and then the apartheid state and its monopoly capitalism, and then into this era of Afro-neoliberal globalization that we've experienced. And when you look closely at the accumulation through ecocide in the South African context, you see what happened during the first part of the Dutch arriving, the genocide that they enacted in the beginning of the ecocidal destruction that they unleashed on this part of the world, what the British took from them and then continued and expanded on in their wave of colonialism through the ethnocide of San communities, the wars of dispossession that they acted out on the inhabitants of this country, the Boer Wars, fighting for control and dominance, and then obviously the takeover of the gold and diamond mining that would set as the foundation for what would become South Africa as the country that we know it. And then obviously Afrikaner nationalism as it took shape during the apartheid era, the racist, religious, and modernizing imaginary conception that further entrenched the land closures that occurred through those previous waves of colonialism, accelerating this extractivist perspective, entrenching carbon-based industrialization, as you can see how important coal has become in this country, or has been in this country, and then obviously boosting productivist agriculture and strengthening financial intermediation that builds on the service sector and this reserve labor force, or this army of labor that it saw in the Black population of this country. And then in the post-apartheid era, the globalized and financialized African nationalism of the ANC has just only continued this dispossession of the commons and only further entrenched this ecocidal logic that occurred through the colonial period and into the apartheid era. So nature has ended up being treated as capital to be exploited. You see this through the way in which the ANC government post-1994 deracialized existing capitalist structures, the way in which it intensified extractivism, putting up carbon-based energy, export-led agriculture, financial integration, mass consumerism, and the expansion of growth. And to survive and to flourish, we need to deal directly with the question of ecocide. We need to resist this eco-imperialism and global monopoly capitalism. And what the Climate Justice Charter seeks to do through its plural vision is to anchor our resistance in the living practice of radical non-racialism, which forms from a history of people and workers' struggle. We're also committed to deepening our decolonial critique of ecocidal capitalism by building positive solidarities across identities through the mass resistance to ensure that the CJCM movement and the democratic eco-socialist program to accelerate and deepen a just transition. The ANC Class Project and the post-apartheid formation, the Freedom Charter, when it was adopted in 1955, established a precedent for democratic public utilities to help deal with the historical legacies of oppression. And despite the calls or the proclamation of a developmental state during the Mbeki era and our current presidency, we've seen a mixture of Western social democracy and aspiration for East Asian tiger-like state intervention occur. We saw the dismantling of the apartheid welfare state and the introduction of the Afro-neoliberal state in the post-apartheid era. And the Jacob Zuma presidency also took this foundation of this Afro-neoliberalism that had happened during the Mbeki era and took it to a new level in the form of the corruption and the mafia state that ended up coming out of that. So with the closure of the RDP office during Mandela's presidency, the failure or the turnaround from the RDP program and the introduction of GEAR and the electoral logic of ANC politics, we saw the entrenching of the electoral machine at the heart of the ANC alliance. We also saw the dominance of the ANC entrenching co-option, division, and marginalization of various material inducements. And the reproduction of the accumulation through ecocide and capitalism. We've seen the translation of this neoliberalism or Afro-neoliberalism being grounded in several policy thrusts within the ANC states, particularly financialization and the NDP. And also we've seen the way in which South Africa has intensified its carbon economy with 85% of our electricity generated from coal. And under the Zuma administration in particular, we saw that coal production and revenues hit unprecedented historical terms. And we've also seen the push for more mining, including coal mining and several new coal mine operations during that period. And with Operation Pagisa, the ANC has expanded this to the ocean commons, its ecocidal logic, aiming to grow the ocean economy and seeing or projecting that it would contribute 177 billion rand to our GDP by 2030. So that's the expansion of this neoliberal, this neoliberalization of this ecocidal legacy of capital accumulation within our region. And how this extends to the general crisis of socio-ecological reproduction in South Africa. Socio-ecological reproduction, obviously referring to the production of workers, people, and natural relations under the condition of ecocidal capitalism, people's ability to generate the means of existence. And this crisis of socio-ecological reproduction is worsening, and people understand, feel, and experience it in the unemployment crisis, the energy crisis of the blackouts and load shedding, the worsening hunger, the water inequality and stress that people have been dealing with prior to the pandemic, but was exacerbated during the lockdown period, excess deaths during COVID, and our state's inability to deal with this historic health crisis, and also extends to the realm of the household, as we see it in the wave and the scourge of gender-based violence, which is endemic in this country. But there have been responses to this, and there are ways in which civil society activists, communities have come together to try bring positive solutions to this, and the universal basic income grant being one of those. And when we look at the way in which people have dealt with the waves in which this logic has unfolded in the post-apartheid era, and the key conjunctural moments which have taken us further and further away from the transformation that this country required. It begins with the arms race, the arms deal of the 90s, and it goes through to the 2007 Polokwane ANC conference, the Marikana crisis in 2012, the climate shocks of the previous decade that we spoke about in the first panel, Fees Must Fall era, the Life is Dimeni crisis, and the July 2021 violence in KZN. The ANC state, and the ANC-led state, is clashing with forces within its own ranks also, which is spilling out to society, and this violence is continuing and is expanding, and we're seeing that in more and more ways. So finally, towards a people-driven climate justice deal and a climate emergency state for South Africa, the Climate Justice Charter, with its clear vision, is an attempt to confront these multiple crises. And the crisis of political leadership and the state reinforces the approach and the imperative that the CJCM has to accelerate and deepen a just transition from below in communities, workplaces, across multiple sectors, and within the state. People, worker-led power is the basis of CJCM politics. It's calling for a climate justice deal for South Africa to be read with its goals and principles of rethinking the economy, an ecocentric living, and decolonized perspective to undo and bring the much needed and long waited for transformation that this country so desperately needs. The climate justice deal for South Africa will also be designed as an intervention at a macro level, which prioritizes crucial policy thrusts, but will also help to create an umbrella framework for climate justice deals in communities, workplaces, and in local government level. The charter also envisages the remaking and transformation of the state from below through worker and people-driven power. And this requires a new vision and a conception of a climate emergency state with its own competencies and functions and institutions. It also requires a re-embedding of the state by people and worker-driven power within deep just transitions across local communities, and democratic planning that will help localize these climate justice deals. I thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Awande. The next document that is going to be presented is the Transforming South Africa's Criminalized Market Democracy, Advancing Deep Democracy for Deep Just Transition, and Jane Terry is going to present it for us. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Natalie. Before I do, I saw Quincy did join again and he tried to communicate with us. Maybe we can just check. Quincy, are you there? We really would like to take your input if your connection is stabilized.
Thank you, Jane.
Quincy, we can see you, but your picture's a bit jumpy. Maybe if you turn off your picture and then you just have the audio, that might help.
I think exactly.
Okay,
Is that any better?
A bit better. Go for it.
Is that any better? Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much. Now you've seen my face, you know I'm not a robot. Thank you very much to everybody, and thanks for bringing me in. I just want to say thanks in particular to the South Africans who I have the pleasure to know personally for bringing me into this global panel of climate justice talking heads. I'm honored to be here. My name is Quincy Saul. I'm part of the Eco-Socialist International, and I'm calling in right now from the Upa Mountains of Sri Lanka, where I'm working at the Belikola Arboretum. I hope that one or two of the people listening in might look up Eco-Socialist International and the Belikola Arboretum and come check it out. I just want to congratulate everybody for these excellent documents that were produced, for their ideological clarity, and for the strategic movement building. I think people in South Africa, and this team in particular, is really leading the way for the world. And just want to congratulate you on that. I'll try to run through this very quickly. Everybody's covered so much material already. Look, COP27, right? It's the conference of the polluters. Nemo said, I remember I met him in Durban in 2011 at COP17. This is 10 years later, 11 years later. And he said, you know, if Africa looks like a gun, then Nigeria is the trigger where most of the oil comes from. And South Africa is the nozzle, which is where it's all refined. And if we want to carry this dreadful metaphor out, we could say that Cairo is the hammer on the gun, which is being cocked right now in Cairo as part of this global eco-fascist project, as it's been described, to carry out the executed death sentence on Africa. Obviously, the fact that we're at COP27, number 27, and the world in the state it is in, indicates that it's a total failure by any standards. The only larger failure, I think, than the failure of the parties to do anything positive about climate change is actually the failure of NGO activists, NGO professionals, who also for now 27 times have failed to make any significant change or impact on these events other than being window dressing, really. So I have good comrades, don't get me wrong, who are there right now, also adherents of Eco-Socialist International, but I struggle with these comrades. Comrades, what are you really doing there? You know, would you still be going if someone else weren't paying for your tickets? Who is paying for your tickets? Maybe go back to your organizations and ask them if money might be better spent on something else. Hugo Chavez famously said that you know, the presidents go from summit to summit while the people go from abyss to abyss. And I think a lot of the NGO activist organizer professionals who've been going to COP for decades are guilty of also going from summit to summit while people are going from abyss to abyss. What will the future generations think, comrades? You've spelled it out very well. It's a Holocaust. You've called it a global gas chamber. We're talking about numbers in the tens of millions and hundreds of millions and billions of people. All the way back at COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen, Lumumba Dieng, the negotiator from Sudan, compared what was happening to a Holocaust. Desmond Tutu said, you know, over a decade ago that this is a crisis is going to kill hundreds of millions of Africans alone. So let's be honest, comrades. I fear we're not being honest enough sometimes. There is no climate justice. I certainly don't see it today. I think we should stop talking like the NGO professionals and start talking like the revolutionaries that we need to be if we're going to be accountable to future generations. And I think that's what the team at COPAC has begun to do.
Sorry,
there's not any climate justice now for the people who've never gotten in a car or plane in their lives.
Sorry, Quincy, the people in the chat are saying that you break up quite a bit.
Okay, understood. Good luck. I'll write it up.
Okay, cool. Okay. Thank you, Quincy. Or I don't know. Some people... Okay, thank you so much, Quincy. Okay, then moving back to Jane to present the next strategic perspective document. Yes.
Great, thank you, Natalie. Okay, I do see we're running out of time, so I'm going to try and keep this quite quick. I'm presenting on strategic document number 3, transforming South Africa's criminalized market democracy, advancing deep democracy for deep, just transitions. Slide. Okay, so this document has 8 parts, and I'll cover each of them separately, starting with an analysis of the crisis of the third wave of global democratization, then looking at South Africa's criminalized market democracy, its dangers, limits of liberal responses, and then some alternatives or cycles of resistance to defend democracy. And then finally, we end with the kind of democracy we need, which is deep democracy and some strategic priorities to achieve this. So the introduction starts by saying that South Africa's democracy is vaunted as a miracle and victory over racial oppression. Our constitution too is a great achievement in the context of a deeply polarized society. But only elements of our constitutional democracy have been realized, making it unfinished and even dangerously poised for a great reversal. Instead, South Africa has become a shallow and weak market democracy, and the deep democracy approach of the Climate Justice Charter movement defends the unfinished constitutional democracy project. Market democracy and the crisis of the third wave of global democratization. So modern democracy with rights, freedoms, institutions, and democratic practices is very young. In fact, it's a product of 500 years of struggle. And it must be noted that democracy also doesn't belong to capitalism. It has always been against capitalism. In fact, liberals and liberal ideology have tried to control and utilize democracy to protect privilege, power, and ecocidal capitalism. There have been 3 waves of democratization. First, the late 19th century, and then after World War II, and then from the early 1970s till about 2006. In each of these waves, liberal forces have limited the realization of democratic rights, freedoms, and power for the colonial other, women, and nature. And as a result, we have a shallow market democracy, which has produced authoritarian neoliberalism and a new fascism. Anti-democratic forces have exploited the weakness of shallow market democracies, and power has been given to digital monopolies and the commercial press. The left made a cardinal mistake of not deepening democracy and ensuring consistent mobilization of the workers and people. So how has the ANC-led alliance constructed South Africa's criminalized market democracy? By globalizing South Africa on the terms of transnationalizing monopoly capital, and as a result, the state is more responsive to the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, transnational corporations, and credit rating agencies than the democratic public. As it privileges the market, it has failed to construct a constitutional state, and as a result, anti-constitutionalism has grown and is becoming more pervasive in society, including in the practice of some political parties and leaders. The ANC-led alliance has also disabled independent and united labor movements. And since the infamous arms deal, the ANC-led alliance has placed South Africa on a path of criminalized accumulation. Assassinations and coercive pressure against whistleblowers is becoming endemic across the economy. As is ecocidal accumulation, which has brought dispossession, violence, and looting. And there have been, just clicking on the right slide. There have also been assassinations of innocent community members, such as Sikosipi Radebe, and then Comrade Vikilin Chingasi. So South Africa's public and commercial media has increasingly played into the factional and polarizing politics of South Africa's criminalized market democracy. Now, there are several dangers facing South Africa's criminalized market democracy, and the document goes into detail, but I've just listed them here. Crises of social production, xenophobia, exclusionary African white nationalism, racism, scare tactics and performative gestures, polarization, weaponized identities, weak state, corruption, and violent protests. Now, there have also been some responses to South Africa's criminalized market democracy, and in particular, these are liberal responses. However, these responses have serious limits. First, DA, which is problematic because its whiteness and white control has limited growth in the institutional political system, and it's incapable of presenting credible alternatives that win the confidence of the vast majority of the people. The DA's response to South Africa's criminalized market democracy is limited because it does not address the conditions underlying the criminalized market democracy, and it doesn't speak to the majority who is excluded by market democracy. In addition, the DA has a greenwash approach to the climate crisis. Second liberal response is that of Musi Maimani's One SA movement, which is gambling on Black disaffection from the ANC, and their strategy is about border representation within a criminalized market democracy, but not about transforming it. And then there's AKF's liberal response, which is the Defend Democracy campaign. And we've got 4 problematic premises in the document, but I'll just outline the first 2. It situates the crisis of corrupt politicians and doesn't appreciate that deep globalization and transnational monopoly capital are fundamental causes of the crisis of market democracy, and it falsely assumes that emergent Black capital is a democratizing force, and it supports its shallow transition, the Presidential Climate Commission's green capitalist approach, and dangerous objective of net zero by 2050. So there have been the liberal responses, but in post-apartheid South Africa, there have also been 3 cycles of resistance to defend and deepen democracy, 94 to 2001. Some examples include TAC and Landless People's Movement, 2005 to 2018. Some examples include Abakhali and the Deba Crisis Committee, Marikana Strike Committee, Save SA, Life After Coal, SAFC, and Fees Must Fall. And then 2019 to the present includes the Climate Justice Coalition, the C19 Coalition, SAFTU Working Class Summit, SAFC National Food Crisis Forum, CJCM, Community Safety and Peace Building Initiatives, DRE Must Fall, and Oceans Not Oil. And in each of these cycles, social forces have been claiming rights, inventing transformative politics, and asserting a new democratic imaginary for social change. But now the challenge is for them to converge around a common political project. And if we don't do so, the right-wing shift will strengthen and the crisis will continue. So we need a deep democracy with deep, just transitions. As we all know, the ANC alliance has failed to address the legacies of apartheid, and there is now a huge gulf between the rulers and the ruled. The scale of the crises we are living in demands something completely different. We need transformation from below through deep democracy. People and workers have to constitute power and build capacities to control and shape planning, policy, decisions, and implementation. And this must be guided by the Charter and must draw on tacit knowledge, local knowledge, scientific, indigenous, and critical emancipatory ecology perspectives. Finally, the document lists 13 strategic priorities for the CJCM to achieve deep democracy and rescue South Africa's constitutional democracy. And these are to break with deep globalization and shallow market democracy through climate justice deals, to close inequality gaps in race, class, and gender, to implement a universal basic income grant, accelerate the realization of food sovereignty pathways, build capacity from below for workers and people to lead the deep just transition, advance a people-driven climate emergency state, support the initiative for whistleblower legislation and the Zondo Commission recommendations, rebuild community policing forums, rethink the incarceration complex in terms of restorative justice, develop a social media and media regulatory architecture, realign South Africa's intelligence agencies and state surveillance capacities, encourage the South African labor movement to organize foreign workers and affirm worker internationalism, and finally, support the development practices that strengthen electoral competition. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Jane. So Awande gave a recommendation, if Quincy is still here, if he could just put his the comments into the chat. Yes. And then Rob also had to go and he gave his number in case anyone wants to contact him. And then we're going to have Uncle Vishwa Satgar, who is going to present our next paper, which is about ensuring South Africa's 2024 elections are climate justice elections. So over to you, Vish.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. I'm just going to, like else, just outline some of the key points in the document. Can everybody see that? I'm assuming you can, Natalie. Yes. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So not all climate politics is transformative about socio-ecological systems change. I think that's becoming very, very clear to all of us. We've used particular tactics and repertoires, but they haven't really won the battle for us. We're really losing ground every time these COPs happen, every time our ruling elites posture around this problem. We need to shift power, the entire power structure in communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state. None of the political parties in South Africa are serious about the general crises of social reproduction, but particularly the worsening climate crisis and its risks. This document deals with some of the ideological foundations and the paradigm of power, informing how we even thinking about a mass movement, but also a movement party role in electoral moments and the various strategic legs we want to walk on to fight the fight. So climate justice politics, in our view, is the new transformative politics. It's about system change, not climate change. And this means ending carbon capitalism if we want to survive. Carbon capitalism is organized in national spaces. This is where the coal, oil, gas kind of flows. And this is where we've got to fight the fight to phase it out and win the climate emergency. Now, how to achieve the end of carbon capitalism? Well, we have different responses to this. The old left would argue, well, we need a vanguard armed with a theory and it'll take state power. You have an anarchist politics, which valorizes what happens from below and procedural democracy to the point where it's also ineffective. And of course, you have social democratic, technocratic, elitist politics. All of these forms of left politics are not up to the task in terms of what we have to do. We have to ensure that everyone around shaping its trajectory towards deep and a just transition. So we are arguing that climate justice politics is about a new conception of politics. It's how to achieve socio-ecological systems change, and it's about a new paradigm of power, which I'll talk to just now. Transformative politics in this frame is also intersectional politics. It is decolonial, so it's deeply about challenging Euro-American supremacy. It is about emancipatory feminism, finding convergences between Marxist, socialist, ecological, indigenous, but also radical queer politics. It is anti-ecocide. It's anti this logic that's destroying human and non-human life on scale, and it is anti-capitalist. In other words, it is for a kind of democratic eco-socialism that's also intersectional. So the climate justice project is our fundamental strategic objective. And for us to achieve this, we positioning this project to confront the polycrisis of capitalism. The climate justice project, as has been mentioned, has a revision. In other words, it speaks to the legacies of the past. It speaks to the current systemic crises or crises of socio-ecological reproduction, and it's about securing a just, livable, and democratic future. It's fundamentally about the commons and commoning. All the building blocks of everything we have relates to water, land, oceans, forests, biodiversity, labor, energy, etc. These are the commons that have built everything we have. And so central to our project is to ensure the defense of the commons and, of course, its enrichment. Our means to do this are through democratic systemic reforms. This is the key strategic idea that we are working with for the deep and accelerated just transition. And democratic systemic reforms are driven from below by people and workers, and we're building them now in the present as we decarbonize workplaces, as we build adaptive systems, as we put into place climate justice deals, etc. Central to all of this is the idea of a democratic eco-socialist program. And so as we develop the charter, we are also working in this direction. So the forms of power that we need to master on this terrain of struggle, of the deep just transition, is systems change. So building the new socio-ecological systems that will decarbonize and save life and meet needs, building movement power, building direct power in the streets, symbolic power, but also constitutional power, using the tools of the Constitution so that we can also deepen the democracy and the deep just transition. So as we work, as we go down this path to accelerate and deepen the just transition, which is our immediate strategy, grounded in the plurivision of the Charter, we are translating the Charter policy. So what does a water common policy look like? What does community on renewable energy look like? At the same time, develop the tools and the capacities to organize in communities, in workplaces, in sectors, and the state to drive the deep just transition. And today we're launching two important tools, one a movie, but the other a planning tool for people and workers to lead this kind of politics. Now, typical political parties cannot lead and deepen and accelerate the just transition for various reasons. They are stuck in electoral cycles. And in South Africa, like in many parts of the world, we have a choiceless democracy in terms of every party playing on the terrain of neoliberal globalization. Politics is also transactional and entrepreneurial. It's about blue lights, it's about fat cat salaries, it's about using institutional politics to trade, influence, etc. And it's as degenerate as that. And thirdly, parties are not committed to accelerating the deep just transition through worker and people-led democratic systemic reforms from below. They are reformist, but not transformative. So we are grappling with this issue about how do we build now going forward. And for us, it's crucial for us to keep in sight, front and center, that our fundamental character is mass-based, people and worker-driven. And in that context, we are building a movement that needs to address the crises of socio-ecological reproduction, address them from below, but also from above. We need to build a new political instrument that works with these forms of power that I mentioned. This is not the same as a movement or the same as a party. There have been interesting international experiences where parties, left parties, have tried to have this, if you like, mass approach. Connective party, etc. But they were not able to succeed in ensuring an anchoredness, a rootedness, and a bottom-up driven logic. History is overtaking mass forces in South Africa as the crisis deepens and worsens. And it's very, very important that we are able to put forward a climate justice project grounded in a democratic eco-socialist program that provides a space for convergence of all peoples, of all races, feminists, intellectuals, community organizations and movements, and the working class in general. And we walk on one of the strategic legs, which is to accelerate this transition from below. We also want to ensure that this movement is institutionalized in terms of its intersectional politics. For example, so why should the CJCM contest national elections and beyond? Well, the ANC Alliance and state are committed to carbon lock-in. And it's important to consider intervening in the 2024 elections to bring down its majority below 50% to prevent this carbon agenda and lock-ins. We also are dealing with a set of criminalized and rogue forces that are not taking the climate crisis seriously, and there are serious risks that we are facing. We are heading for a 3 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures, and the country is not prepared. And we need a left alternative that can articulate what needs to be done around the climate crisis and what's coming. We also have a crisis of leadership. There's a need for a space and a platform for grassroots women, politically conscious youth, and militant workers to drive a programmatic transformation of South Africa and to be in a parliamentary space to do that while being rooted on the ground. We also have criminalized market democracy, which is also moving to the right, and it's moving to the extreme right. We are becoming increasingly a failed state and becoming a failed democracy. And if there isn't a progressive left-wing intervention in South Africa, South Africa out of the climate crisis. So while our center of gravity and our politics is to drive the just transition from below institutional politics on the terrain of the state and so on. So if the CJCM contests elections, not to win power, but to bring down the ANC's majority and prevent further carbon that can use the electoral tactic, and it will play a movement party role in these electoral moments to deepen democratic practice in parliament, draw attention to inequalities. Our blue light brigade earns just too much money in a country in which there's such stark racial and gender inequalities. And to draw attention to that, we need to mainstream climate emergency and climate science in this parliament, because none of them take it seriously. And we need to reinforce deep, just transition building happening in communities, workplaces, sectors in the state. We have about 11 I think, proposals around this. Several partner organizations have already successfully contested local government elections in Makanda, Lubumbashi, councillors, and we are learning lessons from it. We also coordinate to accelerate and deepen the just transition with local communities. We also need to be playing a movement party role while accelerating and deep the just transition below, ensure we make programmatic advances of the climate justice block in the country. Of course, there's various challenges that come with this. We need to build convergence on strategic perspectives, which we are sharing with all of you today. And yes, we need to take this to every corner of the country. We need to translate it so it's accessible, it's easy to understand, etc. We need to intensify recruitment and mass-based building. We need a democratic eco-socialist program, which we are busy developing and will be developing from below as we move forward. And we need to elaborate an electoral tactic and campaign strategy if we build a consensus to also take the fight to the institutional political level. Thanks.
Thank you, Uncle Vish. We are running a bit over time, but we do have some time to take a few questions, and then we'll give the panel some time to respond. So is there anyone who has any comments to make or questions regarding the strategic documents that were presented? I don't know. Oh, okay. I see Ruth has a hand and someone else and Patrick. So I think we'll start with Ruth and then we'll move over to Patrick. So over to you, Ruth.
Thank you very much. This is Ruth from Malawi. We are happy to participate in this meeting from the start. It was very exciting to hear what is on the ground in South Africa. But my comment would be, I hear a lot of South Africa, but I want to know how countries like Malawi, who are already at the verge of suffering in this consequence of climate change, how can we join hands with comrades in South Africa, because our friends seem to have advanced a lot, which is very progressive on our part. How do we start? Where do we start from countries like Malawi? Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for your comments. And then over to Patrick. Is Patrick wanting to talk? Yes, Patrick.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Great. Yeah, thanks. Such great work everyone's doing. I was just wondering really from Vish whether there's a scope for thinking about the unity of forces, progressive forces. You've known it so well from ancient days, UDF and all the rest, but also the failed starts in the 2010s. What lessons? I mean, it's a very tough time. We've just had exceptionally good protests against offshore gas, which brought together marine conservationists and fisherfolk and community, shoreline communities, climate protesters, the youth. Even today in Durban, Johnny Copeland's Suncoast Casino, down the coast from there in the Western Cape, a couple. I don't know what will happen tomorrow because of the rain, but I've always got a sense that the fragmentation of our CJ movements is a real problem, and I wonder if you address that. And then the second and third components are very disturbing. The trade unions, the biggest one, NUMSA, having made a U-turn this year towards pro-coal, pro-Putin. It's a very, very strange time. Machela Koko became their advisor before he went off to jail. But I mean, these are really difficult problems with a kind of strange pro-coal ideology, even expressed yesterday by Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, presidential candidate. And then third, the community protests. We've really got to see whether, if Sanko was always the sort of, framing of unity in the early 90s, but we've really had very little since then to bring national coherence to all these community protests, most of which I see around, the country being around electricity and the energy injustices and energy racism of ESCOM. can we stitch all of this together? It didn't really seem to be a big priority in that wonderful list of all the things to do, Vishwas, but I mean, maybe I just missed it. Thanks, Comrade.
Thank you, Patrick. I don't think there are any other hands that I can see, so just going to check with the panel if anyone wants to respond. I think we'll start with Awande. Cool.
I will take the first point brought up by Ruth, in that I think if you saw from the perspectives given in the first document in terms of what the CJC, the Climate Justice Charter, and the CJCM are, in terms of their perspectives, obviously being where we are and having started from here, it's not limited to just South African perspectives, but we're speaking from our experiences being here. But those perspectives and those alternatives and that program is something which can easily be translated to the Malawian perspective, and it's for activists in Malawi also to take the agency to join hands with us, such as yourself, and we welcome your engagement, and we're grateful for you being here to give us that perspective from the Malawian perspective, is to take these alternatives and to take this vision and to translate it to the Malawian condition on the ground, so that we can build up together, not for us to dictate and tell you what to do where you are, or to tell another activist to do where they are, but from us as activists to share what we have in terms of these strategic perspectives and these alternative transformative visions, but then also to allow other activists to let those perspectives germinate where they are, allow them to be grown and to be shaped by the perspectives of their context. So we pass that baton on to you as activists in Malawi also to start your own structures there, to translate these alternatives to the Malawian context, so that we can meet each other as you know, inter-Pan-African CJCM structure of pushing this at a continental level.
Thank you, Awande. And then I think we'll move over. Does Jane want to respond to anything?
Thanks, Natalie. I think Awande has addressed Ruth's question, and then I'll leave Patrick's question to Vish. So I have nothing to add.
Thank you, Jane. Okay, over to you, Vish.
Oh, Patrick, thank you for those questions. So I think what we are trying to do is really build the convergences. And the way we developed the charter brought together many, many forces, and that was one phase. And, you know, we've got 273 odd organizations endorsing the charter. That's a start. But we are building on that. And hence we had a strategic dialogue where we invited the key movements we work with to develop these documents. And these documents, we want them to travel. We want them to travel to all forces on the ground. And we will culminate this process in at least 2 conferences next year, national conferences, to bring comrades into a process of building a consensus on how we fight and where we're going in terms of these strategies. That we are connected those comrades. There's a big CJCM festival actually happening this weekend, and it's part of the mass protests that are happening. Oceans Not Oil, SETC, the Active Citizens Movement in Durban are all working with us and are hosting this festival this weekend. So yes, those convergences are emerging organically, and we will deepen this strategic conversation with those comrades and others. The trade unions are complicated. I mean, they're very, very divided. If we around another trajectory for the country, if we present a political program to them, it's very clear that, you know, COSATU is being torn apart. So you have the nationalists, you have some opportunist communists making some noises now, but that is really going to result in a deep and profound fissure inside COSATU. Inside SAFTU, you have the Urban Gym Project, and you have, if you like, the VAVI project, and these things are not sitting together very well. They could also tear SAFTU apart. So I think what we are talking about is a alternative climate justice block of forces with clear strategies, with a clear programmatic orientation, and to work with all forces on the left and around to move this forward. There's a lot to test here, and there's a lot of challenges around this, but this is where we're moving. Comrade Pablo has joined us, and I think he can say something, Natalie, towards the end when you're wrapping up of this panel, but he can maybe reflect also on how the Trade Union Center in Bolivia relates. Thanks.
Thank you, Vish. So yes, we have Pablo Solon, who's joined. So he was supposed to be on panel 1, but we have time for his input now. So Pablo, are you available? Cool. Over to you, Pablo.
Well, first apologies because I had missed my time. I'm now in Bolivia, so sorry. I read your documents. I think that they're very interesting. There's only one question that I have is you don't address very much I think we need to build systemic transitions. So not only climate justice transitions, not only economic justice transitions, not only social justice transition, but more systemic. And systemic means we also have to take into account the perspective from the earth, from nature. A new kind of left has to be a non-anthropocentric left that thinks not only from a human perspective, but it thinks from an earth community perspective. So yeah, this is, I find everything that you have written very interesting, but very little developed this non-anthropocentric perspective. For example, we are discussing why does the UN fail to address climate change? Of course, there are reasons that deal with the fact that the UN system has not a real democracy. You have 5 countries that have veto power and are always in the Security Council. It's in reality, it's a monarchy. But there is also the problem that we are having a process of multilateralism based only on government. And if we want to change this, we need to have representation from civil society, not a formal representation like now, but a real representation that has decision power in the multilateral system. But we also have to bring nature into the multilateral system, represented by scientists, represented by indigenous people, because we're not going to address the climate crisis only from us humans if we don't bring nature perspective into the solution. That's why we also think that we have to build new kind of democracies, not only human democracies, but also non-anthropocentric democracies, where there is the democracy from the earth, where rivers can speak and forests have rights and they are also represented. So I just wanted to highlight this other perspective, that it would be interesting to see how this other side, this non-anthropocentric perspective is also captured in a climate justice approach. Well, thank you, and I apologize again.
Thank you so much, Pablo, and thank you to all the panelists from this panel and the questions. I'm going to hand over now to Putuma to chair the next panel. So cool, thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, and good afternoon to everyone. So in this session now, we will be launching 2 resources, or rather 2 tools for education and building. The first one, we will have Farrell Adams that will be presenting on the CJCM's most recent activist guide. It is titled On People's Planning for Deep Just Transition. And following that, we will have a video by the Rosa Lanzenbeck Foundation. It is titled The Harvest of the Neglect. So without wasting any further time, I think we should go to Farrell Adams on People's Planning for Deep, Just Transitions. Farrell, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Butuma. Just to say, can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so I'm not putting my video on because I've got load shedding, but I will be sharing my screen to share the presentation with you. Just a second. Sorry, just 1 second. I need to find my presentation. It's not coming up. Oh, there you go. Sorry, comrades, just a little technical glitch here. Here it comes. Okay, can you see?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is one of our tools. In fact, many people that were talking about stuff today were talking about what are the practical things, and that's what's so powerful about what we've been doing as the Climate Justice Charter movement, is that we've been looking at the theoretical, but and bringing it down into what is a practical tool that can be used. This is one of many of our tools that we will be launching in the future, but this is the first one. So it's the People's Planning for a Deep, Just Transition. And basically, if you look at the document itself, it has it's broken down in different modules. So it starts off with the glossary so that people can understand some of the terminology that we use. And, some of it is new to people. And we look at the different, so there's about 7 modules. And I'm briefly going to touch on those modules. I'm not going to go into that too much because we are running out of time. So it's just literally touching on it. In terms of the first module on how to use the guide, this is something that we have standard within our guides, and it looks at it explains how to use this as an activist tool. So it can be used to train the trainer, for example, right? And it's focused. This particular one, the planning tool, is focused on transforming our workplaces, communities, and local government with a bottom-up approach rather than what is happening in planning right now, which is a top-down approach. And it gives it, everyone uses a deep just transition, but this puts it into practice. How will we do that? What does it mean in a workplace? And so that's the module 1 and how to use the guide. Just to mention that, and it's a learning process, and we almost, touch on things like Paulo Freire's way of learning, in that opening and awakening critical consciousness through this document and through discussions, through collective learning. And so those principles of collective learning should be kept in mind, and that's learning should be people-centered and should encourage participation. And what that means is to also listen to people on the ground in terms of the challenges that people are facing and the solutions that they have been finding on their own. So it is active. It involves participating in activities and exercises. It is inquiry-based. It continually tries to uncover and explore questions, discussions, debates. And this is something that's missing a lot in, I would say, civil society South Africa that I can speak of, that there isn't enough debate, discussion, and critique that's mature enough to allow people to differ. It builds on existing knowledge and provides processes which encourage people to critically analyze and discuss from their own experience. So, and that's some of the principles of this module, of this document. In terms of module 2, we also, I think one of the very early panelists mentioned the issue of, bringing climate change and the issues so that everybody can understand it. It's not, we can't take it for granted that everyone knows the terminology, that everyone understands climate and socio-ecological crisis. So the second model explains the climate science. It talks about the current climate and ecological crisis we're going through. It then puts it in a perspective of South Africa, but then it also looks at the climate science future for South Africa. And each of the modules ends with an exercise. So the exercise will talk about ending the war with nature. Module 3, which touches on the Climate Justice Charter, and I think that, of course, is an important process. All of these form part and parcel of the Climate Justice Charter. And Module 3 gives a bit of background to how this charter was developed, and I think that is important. It was inclusive, it was consultative, it had different voices, and it put in those voices into this charter. It also talks about a strategic transformation through a climate justice project. And it also talks about what happens if we do not adopt the charter. And that plays into everything that has been presented, especially what Jane and Vish said. So the nice thing is you can see now joining all the dots to the presentations, and what Jane and Vish were talking about, what's happening in politics in South Africa and the political parties and their aspirations, that if we do not adopt this charter, that can go in a direction that could just hamper us even more. So then there's an exercise for people to get in, to understand the charter much better. It has questions around it. It has a little bit of an activity. So it's through those activities that you'll start making real what seems to be a theoretical document. Module 4 is about defining the deep just transition. Everybody talks about the deep just transition. Even some companies talk about in this module is explained. It talks about the principles for a deep just transition and analyzes that in terms of the South Africa's carbon lock-ins But where would that money be used? And those are the kinds of things we need to keep track of. Building capacities for people-led transformation, and then it has an exercise that looks at a shallow transition versus a deep just transition, which is then able to allow people to understand the policies that the government is issuing around climate change and how that's a shallow transition. Module 5 is advancing the deep just transition through democratic planning. So we look at so we have planning in South Africa. In fact, sometimes when you, in this particular section, we talk about, there's some good aspects in our policies, in government policies, and how does planning work in South Africa, right? So you have the integrated development plan, but is that going to advance a deep just transition? Is that process what is needed? And that's what Module 4 looks at. And it looks at some of the obstacles to a participatory planning system. It talks about learning from international examples. We are not an island. We have to be connected. We have to have solidarity running through our towns, our villages, our countries. And that is why we look at international examples. And then also exercise 4 takes it to the extent of how do you understand your planning in your space? What can you do? What should you be doing? And then module 6 is then starting to touch on the actual planning and activism in communities, workplaces, sectors, and local government. So what is local government's active role in advancing the deep just transition? And we look at it's done through an exercise, which is visioning for a climate justice local government. What does that mean? How do we democratize what's been happening in terms of policy, in terms of climate justice? And then we look at what can communities do? What should communities be doing? How can activism in communities reimagine not only our places, in communities, but activism. And then, of course, the workplaces. And I think this is an important one because, you know, Vish said it, our unions are quite divided, and we cannot go forward without also ensuring that these kind of activism must also continue in workplaces. And a simple thing is highlighting air pollution in a work environment, highlighting water pollution in a work environment. How do we get those workplaces to be an eco-centric workplace? So that's module 6. And then that brings us to the conclusion, which is module 7, and accelerating the deep just transition in communities, workplaces, sectors, and local government. And it's taking from everything in this module, it's reflecting. It's about reflections of where we are as a human species, where we are in terms of eco systems, and building around those reflections, and then building a mass-driven climate justice charter movement. So this climate justice charter movement is not some pie in the sky. It then kind of, the picture of it becomes very real. And then also module 7 looks at how can we get, so this tool must be used by trainers, training other, training their communities, training organizations, activists, whatever. But through this and through the exercises to find a space where it says that this is how we're going to support the movement and the campaign to accelerate the deep just transition. So that's it. It really, each module, it takes time going through it. It got exercises. So it's literally a learning tool and an organizing tool that I think we've been missing for a long time. And I hope will be exciting to people as we are excited to launch it. That's it.
Thank you very much, Beryl. Now we will be moving to the video by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation titled The Harvest of Neglect. However, before we move on to the video, we'd like to watch a recording by Roland Ingham as an introduction to the video. Jane, could you please play the recording by Roland?
Anyone who is familiar with Makanda is certainly aware of the water challenges that that city has faced. Unfortunately, Makanda is only a microcosm of a wider and deepening problem in South Africa today. Like the UPM Sayanda Quarter usually says, water is quickly becoming a source of political contestation in the country. And this is because there are so many challenges spread all around the country, and so little has been done to resolve these challenges that it is quickly becoming a crisis. Water Minister Senzo Mchunu really has been saying for a while that the dams are full, but the taps are dry. What is the reason for this? A lot of it has to do with perennial underinvestment. And we wanted to really have a holistic picture of this situation, and that is what drove the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to do a 3-part series on water challenges in South Africa. The first edition, A Harvest of Drought, focused on climate-induced water challenges around the country. Obviously, we are coming out of a multi-year drought, and we wanted to see the impacts of that on different communities and social activities around the country. The second episode, A Harvest of Neglect, focuses on perennial underinvestment in water and reticulation systems in general in South Africa. And this covers a number of very specific foci, Makanda certainly, but also Limpopo. And the idea is to have a holistic picture really of what must be done in the integrated plan that the government has developed. Obviously, you may be aware that the government is planning to invest about 1 trillion rand over the next 10 years in water infrastructure.
Where should that money go? How should that money be utilized? And what are the priority areas that it should start with? All those aspects really will come out in this episode as well as in the next one that we plan to do next year. Both episodes that we already have out feature UPM heavily, as well as COPAC and SALGA. And we believe that the more we talk about these challenges, the more the closer we get to a solution. And hopefully you can all help to spread the message about these films, as well as also continue the conversation at your level so that we continue to foreground these challenges affecting especially the poor, because let's remember, water challenges impose a tax on the poor.
Thank you about that. Could we play the Harvest of Neglect?
We have a human crisis. I'm saying it's a human because I think it's important to give it a face. I'm saying it is a crisis because that's what it is.
Here you have a governance drought, a worsening climate crisis since 2015, when we overshot 1 degree Celsius with its climate extremes, is meeting a failing state in South Africa. That's what's happening here.
And we understand that in our country, water has become the basis of struggle. People are struggling to access water. We bear the brunt of the crisis that we did not commit. If you live in a township where when you go to taps are running dry, there's no water, you know Mississippi is burning. If you live in a township where politicians are not accountable, then you know Mississippi is burning. You know there's no freedom. You know there's no democracy.
This is one stark fact that highlights water inequality in our society. In the everyday life of South Africans, this means that you have water distribution in informal settlements, in poorer communities, etc., that is not able to meet their needs.
I think it is common cause that we have an infrastructure challenge, the aging infrastructure or challenges with maintenance and all of that may affect or be exacerbated by the current climate change impact that we're facing.
The state hasn't been able to kind of design a strategy that is capable of managing existing water infrastructure, planning in the future of water resources. So there's been a strategic failure in terms of governance and practice in the state.
I mean, currently there's a process of relooking at the equitable share in terms of how much of the financial resources and budgets that are being made available to the local sphere of government. And in my view, the biggest chunk of the fiscal should be going there to be able to support and to make sure that there is proper implementation and there's proper compliance and monitoring and evaluation, and then coming back and changing where the systems are failing, where the things are not working.
The other failure around our water regime in South Africa has been corruption. And this has featured at a whole host of levels in the country. in local government, where you're seeing a lot of water systems failure, and as a result, we are behind the curve, both the climate crisis curve, but also the national needs of our society, because of that kind of corruption, cronyism, and kind of incompetence in the state.
In this municipality, we have been experiencing the crisis of water. Council took a decision to build an alternative dam and water plant. So when they started the project, it was estimated to be 50 million. This is now the 7th year. The project is standing at 237 million. They estimated that they will complete the project by 2024. By then, it will be standing at $500 million from 50 million.
I have visited Makhanda as part of my research, and I found various things that were quite striking and shocking. I found that the actual supply of water to households is not properly documented and recorded. So you don't know what literage is being consumed in any household.
Here in Makhanda, you've got a problem of sewer that is affecting the water, the sewer everywhere that is running in our homes, on the streets. So we are at the risk of drinking water with E. coli.
What you're seeing in Makhanda is because of failing political leadership. You're actually putting people not just into desperation, but you're putting them into a struggle to survive.
The Department of Water has not taken the responsibility of what is happening at James Clean Hands. The provincial government is supposed to be playing an oversight role. They are aware that we have been subjected to a water that is contaminated, but there are no consequences. The Auditor General used the words that our municipalities are the den of thieves.
A lot of money came from the central government to sort out various problems. Money came, but that money was basically captured and corruptly taken away. I think the grand heist is a very accurate way of capturing the theft, the grand scale of theft, over a decade of public resources that were meant to solve the problem and meet the needs of the people.
Corruption could be a very theoretical word, or something that we can think of in very hypothetically, but in reality it means starving. It takes away the dignity. It condemns us, it condemns our lives to that of a poverty with no hope, with no solution.
Access to clean water is a constitutional right of every citizen in this country. And I think it's important for us to witness, for us to realize the vulnerability of that access to clean water as a result of many factors.
We are saying that we got to have a deep, just transition that is driven from below. We cannot allow the climate crisis and its multiple challenges to be, if you like, in the hands of the state.
We need more than just ourselves. We need all spheres of government. We need private sector. We need civil society. We need international organizations that are skilled in this sort of things to be able to take hands.
If we do not get that politics right, as climate justice activists, as citizens, because this problem has to be owned by everyone. Activists are not going to solve this problem. We are going to constantly be trapped in this nightmare, and it's only going to get worse. So there's a need for agency, there's a need for all living in South Africa to step up and to ensure we democratize all these problems. If we do not do that, and I've said this before, water is going to tear this country apart. It is going to be the source of great conflict in South Africa.
We've got to turn another leaf. I think the politics of humanity are quite important and fundamental politics, the politics of hope, the politics of love, that we are able to turn another leaf, that we are able to find our mission, we are able to fulfill our mission on earth.
Thank you very much. We'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to Farrell Adams on her presentation on the Activist Guide. We would also like to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation on this very heart-touching and yet crucial video they've shared with us. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we will not be having a question and answer session for this part. However, we do encourage people to continue engaging on these conversations. We have posted several links on the chat. These links are to do with all the tools that have been shared today. So we encourage everyone to go there and engage on the tools further. I would like to hand over to Vish for closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Comrades, when we took the Climate Justice Charter to Parliament on October 16th, 2020, we took it under the banner, End Hunger, Thirst, Pollution, and Climate Harm. And this basically is the crux of how we are doing climate justice politics in South Africa. The Charter emerges out of almost 6-7 years of campaigning by the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign during one of the worst droughts in the history of the country. We foregrounded the link between high food prices and climate shocks. We marched in the streets of Joburg, we had drought speakouts, and then of course we reached the conclusion that we need this charter to address this very complex, very multifaceted problem. The South African Climate Justice Charter is a charter of the people and the workers of this country. Today we inaugurated a different phase of how we're building and organizing the Climate Justice Charter movement. Today we launched our strategic perspective documents. We were very humbled and grateful for comrades that came forward from some of the leading climate justice movements in the world. Peoples, which Pablo works with and organizes, whether it's from Nimo Basi and many, many others, the former anti-apartheid movement and so on. I think what we were trying to do here was recognize that to start decentralizing power, we need to have a new concentration of power. We need to redistribute power in the world. And that's why we are calling for a climate justice bloc of governments, particularly vulnerable island states, particularly countries devastated by climate shocks, countries in regions facing twice the global average heating like our own, movements, people, and workers to come together. We have historical experience to guide us from the 20th century, different forms of internationalism, and the lesson from all those internationalisms, the convergence of governments, peoples, movements. And this is what we're going to be working towards. Today's conversation was catalytic. It was testing this perspective with all comrades from across the world. And it's clear that there is strong interest and a strong support for us to move in this direction. Digital technology platforms like this make the hosting of an assembly for climate justice, a coordinating committee for climate justice, and for a climate justice bloc possible. And as we go forward, we will be working in this direction. There were others critical to this conversation, the vulnerable island states, etc., who will be bringing into this conversation. Countries that have been impacted by climate on our continent, we'll be bringing those activists, movements, governments, etc., into this conversation and process of building this climate justice bloc. If we don't do this, comrades, we are going to remain hostage to an elite process that is really taking us all to extinction. So this for us is a very, very crucial strategy. The three other documents we launched today frame a strategic perspective on the crises of socio-ecological reproduction in South Africa. And these crises are worsening. The ANC-led alliance and state is committed to the carbon lock-in. It's committed to more oil, coal, and gas. And it is not preparing our country for the climate crisis. And we lay that out in our analysis. We also know that our democracy is on the brink of actually collapse in some instances, losing the gains that we've all fought for. And it's important that we revive and renew our constitutional democratic project. And our argument here today is that the defense and the deepening of the Constitution is central to climate justice politics. We will draw on the Constitution to have deep democracy in communities, in workplace sectors, and the state as we accelerate and deepen the just transition from below. But we've also made the argument today, comrades, as we inaugurate this phase of base, a people and worker-driven movement. We have to root this movement in every corner, every sector, every community, every workplace in the country. Without mass power, there is no hope. Without mass power, we cannot lead the transformations that have to happen. Without mass power, we cannot push the state in the direction that we need to take it into. It's time now, comrades, for us to move bits. All of that's important. But what we need now is a politics that shifts power in communities, workplaces, including the state. We've opened up a debate here today also about contesting elections, the 2024 national election, not to take over power, but to put in place a stop, if you like, to gridlock the trajectory of carbon capitalism in South Africa. So again, we invite you to take on that debate and to take perspectives forward. We've shared a set of resources with you today. There'll be a suite of resources around how we deepen and accelerate the just transition. The tool on planning is the first of many that we will be developing with you. The movie we put out, again, use it as a resource. There are many, many resources like this. Take the conversation forward, have debates, bring people, join the climate justice charter movement. The next steps for us, comrades, are for all of us to own this process. Take the documents into your communities, into your organizations, into your families, into your friendship networks. Have discussions based on these documents. We are going to culminate this process in 2 national conferences next year. There'll be a conference in March and there'll be a conference in October. And we're hoping that we would have built a sufficient consensus on these strategic pillars together to fight this fight. With that, I want to say a very big thank you to our international friends and guests that came, to all of you who participated, the COPAC team who convenes and organizes the Climate Justice Charter movement. Comrades, let's work together. Let's build a powerful movement. Thank you and take care.